Case 1, August 10, 1991, Phoenix, Arizona. 9 people were found executed inside a Thai Buddhist temple. The first signs of trouble appeared when temple members failed to respond to morning prayers. Inside the living quarters of the Wat Promkanaram temple, authorities discovered bodies arranged face down in a circle, each shot at close range. Within days, attention turned towards 17-year-old Jonathan Duty, a local teenager with known ties to the temple community. The discovery occurred in the early hours when concerned visitors entered the temple compound after repeated attempts to reach the monks went unanswered. Inside the residence area, 9 victims were located on the floor, shot execution style with multiple rounds. 17 spent .22 caliber shell casings and shotgun shells were scattered across the room. Although the living quarters appeared ransacked, investigators noted that valuable temple relics and gold items had been left untouched. The initial theory focused on robbery. 4 men from Tucson were arrested and interrogated extensively. Each provided confessions under prolonged questioning. However, as detectives compared their statements with physical evidence from the scene, inconsistencies began to surface. Key details in their accounts did not align with ballistic findings, forcing investigators to reconsider their direction. The victims included 6 monks, a nun, a novice, and a temple helper, all members of a close-knit Thai Buddhist community serving the Phoenix area. They lived modestly inside the temple compound, maintaining daily routines centered on prayer, study, and community outreach. Jonathan Duty lived nearby and had previously visited the temple, giving him familiarity with the layout and residence. Prosecutors later alleged that the motive was robbery, estimating that approximately $2,600 in cash and some audiovisual equipment had been taken. Investigators theorized that one of the monks may have recognized Duty during the break-in. Authorities believed that recognition escalated the situation from burglary to deliberate mass execution. It would take only days for the quiet spiritual sanctuary to become the focus of a nationwide homicide investigation. As forensic teams processed the crime scene, ballistic testing connected a .22 caliber rifle and a shotgun to the weapons used in the killings. The earlier confessions from the Tucson suspects began to unravel under scrutiny, with defense attorneys arguing they had been coerced. Courts later determined those confessions were unreliable. Investigators shifted their focus after linking the recovered firearms to Duty and his 16-year-old acquaintance, Alessandro Garcia. Garcia eventually provided statements implicating Duty as the primary shooter, while admitting his own role in firing the shotgun to ensure no survivors. Detectives reconstructed the timeline of the night, concluding the pair entered the temple intending to steal money and eliminate witnesses. Physical evidence and Garcia's testimony placed Duty inside the residence during the killings. In 1993, Jonathan Duty was convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder, along with robbery and burglary charges. The prosecution relied heavily on a confession obtained during interrogation and on Garcia's testimony. Years later, appellate courts determined that Duty's confession had been coerced and improperly admitted at trial. His conviction was overturned in 2011. A retrial ended in a hung jury in 2013. Prosecutors proceeded with a 3rd trial later that year, presenting physical evidence and renewed testimony from Garcia. In December 2013, a jury again found Duty guilty on all counts. The verdict marked the conclusion of a lengthy legal process spanning more than 2 decades and multiple courtroom proceedings. In January 2014, Jonathan Duty was sentenced to 9 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Alessandro Garcia, who had entered a plea agreement years earlier, received a life sentence in exchange for his testimony. The case became widely cited in discussions about coerced confessions and interrogation practices in the United States. Legal scholars examined the early investigative errors, particularly the discarded Tucson confessions. For the families of the victims and the Phoenix Thai community, the final conviction closed a prolonged chapter of uncertainty. Memorial services and annual remembrances continued at the temple grounds. The massacre remained one of the deadliest attacks on a religious site in modern American history. Case 2. July 22, 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Tracy Edwards escaped from an apartment in handcuffs and flagged down police officers on the street. The first signs of trouble appeared when officers returned with him to the Oxford Apartments and entered Unit 213. Inside, they located photographs documenting bound and dismembered bodies. Within days, attention turned toward 31-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer, the tenant of the apartment and the man Edwards had identified. When officers conducted a protective sweep of the apartment, they discovered a knife and a set of photographs showing human remains posed in various stages of dismemberment. A further search revealed a severed human head inside a refrigerator and additional remains stored in plastic bags and containers. Investigators also located chemicals, including acid, used to dissolve tissue. As detectives expanded the search, they uncovered skulls, bones, and preserved body parts hidden throughout the unit. The apartment confirmed evidence of multiple killings spanning years. Dahmer was arrested at the scene without resistance. The evidence collected during that initial search immediately transformed the case from a single assault report into one of the most extensive homicide investigations in Milwaukee's history. The victims were primarily young men, many of whom Dahmer met in bars, shopping malls, or on city streets. He often lured them to his apartment with offers of money in exchange for photographs or companionship. Once inside, authorities later determined he drugged and restrained them. His pattern of violence dated back to 1978, when his first known victim was killed in Ohio. Over the years, he relocated and continued the killings, eventually settling in Milwaukee. Neighbors described him as quiet and reserved, someone who rarely drew attention despite occasional complaints about odors. Few suspected the scale of violence concealed behind the apartment door. It would take only days for investigators to link multiple missing persons cases directly to his residence. Forensic teams cataloged remains recovered from the apartment and conducted DNA and dental record comparisons. 17 victims were eventually linked to Dahmer through physical evidence and his detailed confession. Detectives documented his statements describing the methods he used and the timeline of the killings. Skulls and bones found in the apartment matched reports of missing individuals from Milwaukee and other states. Investigators reconstructed travel histories and employment records to confirm his presence near victims before they disappeared. The scale of evidence removed any doubt about the number of homicides connected to the apartment. The case file expanded rapidly as law enforcement agencies across jurisdictions collaborated to confirm identities and close, long-unsolved missing persons reports. Dahmer was formally charged with 15 counts of first-degree intentional homicide in Wisconsin. He later admitted to 2 additional killings committed in Ohio. During court proceedings, his defense entered pleas of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. Prosecutors presented evidence demonstrating planning, concealment, and efforts to avoid detection. Jurors heard testimony from forensic experts and investigators detailing the physical findings inside the apartment. After deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity defense. In February 1992, Dahmer was convicted on all 15 Wisconsin counts. The verdict established criminal responsibility for one of the most extensive serial homicide cases in modern American history. In February 1992, Dahmer received 15 consecutive life sentences in Wisconsin, later adding another life term for the Ohio conviction, totaling 16 life terms. He was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Initially placed in protective custody due to the notoriety of his crimes, he was later assigned to a work detail within the prison. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked by another inmate during a cleaning assignment and died from his injuries. His death closed the criminal proceedings but did not end public scrutiny. The case prompted internal reviews of police responses to earlier complaints and influenced reforms in handling missing persons reports nationwide. Case 3. October 11, 1989, Texas. A convicted killer was released on parole after more than 2 decades in prison. The first signs of trouble appeared when young women began disappearing across central Texas in 1991. Their vanishing seemed unconnected at first, occurring in different towns along major highways. Within days of investigators comparing timelines and travel routes, attention turned toward Kenneth McDuff, a man once sentenced to death for a 1966 triple murder. By early 1991, multiple young women were reported missing from areas near Waco, Temple, and other Texas communities. Some disappeared after leaving work. Others were last seen near highway corridors. Weeks later, remains began to surface in rural locations. The discoveries suggested a pattern. Victims were being taken from populated areas and transported to isolated sites. Communities grew alarmed as reports intensified and families demanded answers. Law enforcement agencies began reviewing unsolved disappearances from the previous months, identifying similarities in timing and geography. Investigators noted that the disappearances often occurred near interstate routes, frequently used by transient workers and truck drivers. The evidence at recovery sites indicated deliberate concealment. As cases accumulated, authorities suspected a single offender operating across jurisdictions. The victims were primarily young women, many working entry-level jobs or traveling alone. Their backgrounds varied, but the circumstances of their disappearances shared common elements. Kenneth McDuff had been convicted in 1966 for abducting and killing 3 teenagers near Everman, Texas. Originally sentenced to death, his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. After legislative changes and parole review decisions, he was released in 1989. His release sparked little public notice at the time. However, as 1991 disappearances mounted, investigators began reviewing parole records of known violent offenders in the region. McDuff's prior history of kidnapping and murder placed him among individuals requiring scrutiny. It would take only weeks before detectives began tracing his movements against the timeline of missing persons. Texas Rangers and local law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts to analyze motel registries, employment records, and vehicle descriptions. Witnesses described a tall man driving a pickup truck seen near some victims shortly before they vanished. Investigators mapped McDuff's known travel routes and temporary job sites, identifying overlaps with disappearance locations. Motel logs placed him in towns where victims were last seen. The U.S. Marshals Service joined the search after evidence connected him to at least one homicide scene. As forensic results confirmed matches between recovered remains and missing persons reports, the case expanded. The pattern of highway-related abductions narrowed the suspect pool. When investigators confirmed McDuff had abruptly left Texas, a multi-state manhunt began. On May 4, 1992, Kenneth McDuff was located and arrested at a work site in Kansas City, where he had been living under an alias. He was returned to Texas to face charges related to the 1991 murder of Melissa Northrup. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence and witness testimony placing him with the victim shortly before her disappearance. The jury convicted McDuff of capital murder and sentenced him to death. Additional investigations linked him to several other killings committed after his parole release. Although not all cases resulted in formal convictions, authorities publicly associated him with multiple 1991 homicides. The conviction marked the end of a search that had spanned multiple states and agencies. Kenneth McDuff was executed by lethal injection on November 17, 1998, at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. His case prompted renewed scrutiny of Texas parole policies and early release decisions. Lawmakers reviewed procedures governing violent offender eligibility and supervision standards. Families of the victims cited systemic failure, arguing that his release directly enabled further killings. Public debate focused on whether warning signs had been overlooked during parole evaluation. The case became a reference point in discussions about sentencing reform and risk assessment for repeat offenders. While the execution concluded the legal process, it left ongoing questions about accountability within the criminal justice system. Case 4, June 29, 1991, Rosebud, Victoria. 6-year-old Sherry Beasley was reported missing after riding her bicycle near her home. The first signs of trouble appeared when she failed to return that afternoon, prompting her family to alert neighbors and police. Search efforts began immediately across the quiet coastal town. Within days, attention turned toward Robert Lowe, a local church volunteer who had been seen speaking with the child. On the afternoon she disappeared, witnesses reported seeing a man matching Robert Lowe's description near a convenience store, talking to a young girl with a bicycle. Police canvassed the area and organized a coordinated search involving residents and officers. As daylight faded, concern escalated. Days later, Sherry Beasley's body was located inside a stormwater drain not far from where she was last seen. The discovery shifted the case from a missing persons investigation to a homicide inquiry. Detectives secured the area and began documenting forensic evidence. The timeline narrowed to the hours between her departure from home and the witness sighting. The recovery of the body intensified scrutiny of individuals known to have interacted with her that day. Sherry Beasley lived with her family in a close-knit community where children commonly rode bicycles through neighborhood streets. Rosebud was considered a safe town, with residents familiar with one another through schools, churches, and local events. Robert Lowe was known in the area as a Sunday school volunteer and church member who participated in youth activities. He was viewed as cooperative and approachable. His presence near the store on the day of the disappearance did not initially raise alarm. However, as detectives reviewed witness accounts and his movements, they began to compare his timeline with the critical hours before the body was found. It would take only days for investigators to focus directly on him as a person of interest. During questioning, Lowe provided statements regarding his whereabouts that shifted when repeated. Detectives noted discrepancies between his account and witness reports. Search efforts expanded to areas he was known to visit, including isolated drainage systems and scrubland. Forensic analysis confirmed that the cause of death was consistent with homicide. Evidence gathered from the drainage site aligned with the timeframe established by investigators. Officers reconstructed Lowe's movements using witness statements and physical evidence. As contradictions accumulated, the case against him strengthened. The consistency between recovered evidence and witness accounts placed him near the location where the body was discovered, narrowing investigative focus exclusively to him. Robert Lowe was formally arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder following intensive questioning. Authorities reported that he provided admissions consistent with the evidence recovered from the drainage site. Prosecutors proceeded with charges based on physical findings and his statements. The trial moved forward in 1992, with the court reviewing forensic results, witness testimony, and investigative records. The prosecution presented a clear sequence of events linking Lowe to the abduction and killing. The defense had limited grounds to challenge the physical evidence and documented inconsistencies. The proceedings concluded with a jury verdict finding him guilty on both charges. In 1992, Robert Lowe was convicted of kidnapping and murdering Sherry Beasley and sentenced to life imprisonment. The court established a non-parole period reflecting the seriousness of the offense. The case prompted widespread reflection within the Rosebud community regarding trust and familiarity in small towns. Residents re-examined safety measures for children and the assumption that known individuals posed no risk. Annual commemorations continued in memory of Sherry Beasley. The conviction concluded the legal process, but discussions about safeguarding children in close-knit communities persisted long after sentencing. Case 5. November 3, 1991, Lima, Peru. 15 civilians were shot at a neighborhood gathering in the Barrios Altos district. The first signs of trouble appeared when masked gunmen entered the courtyard and ordered victims to lie face down on the floor. Within minutes, automatic gunfire echoed through the building. Within days, attention turned toward Grupo Colina, a covert military unit operating under Peru's intelligence apparatus. The attack unfolded during a fundraising party held in a residential building on Girón Huanta. Witnesses later reported that several armed men arrived in vehicles and moved through the courtyard with coordination. They forced those present to the ground and opened fire using automatic weapons at close range. 15 people were killed, and 4 others were seriously injured. The entire assault lasted only minutes before the gunmen departed. Authorities initially issued statements suggesting the violence was the work of insurgents linked to the Shining Path. However, survivors described the attackers as disciplined and organized, raising doubts about that explanation. As details emerged, investigators began examining possible involvement by security forces rather than insurgent groups. The victims were residents and community members gathered for a traditional event, including workers, students, and families with no established links to insurgent activity. At the time, Peru was engaged in an internal armed conflict against the Shining Path, a Maoist guerrilla organization responsible for bombings and assassinations. President Alberto Fujimori had taken office in 1990 and authorized aggressive counterinsurgency measures. In that climate, security operations often blurred legal boundaries. Despite official claims that the victims were insurgent sympathizers, later investigations found no credible evidence connecting those killed to militant groups. The massacre instead reflected a broader pattern of extrajudicial actions attributed to clandestine units operating within the state security structure. Human rights organizations and independent investigators began collecting testimony from survivors and analyzing ballistic evidence. Over time, evidence linked the attack to Grupo Colina, a death squad composed of members of Peru's military intelligence service. The unit operated covertly, targeting individuals suspected of supporting insurgents. Documentation and witness accounts pointed toward high-level authorization. Links were traced to intelligence advisor Vladimiro Montesinos, who oversaw national intelligence operations during the Fujimori administration. As political conditions shifted in the late 1990s and early 2000s, previously concealed records and testimonies surfaced. These findings indicated that the massacre had been part of a broader counterterrorism strategy conducted outside judicial oversight. In 2000, the Fujimori government collapsed amid corruption scandals, and Fujimori fled Peru. He was later arrested in Chile in 2005 and extradited to Peru. Prosecutors charged him with human rights violations, including responsibility for the Barrios Altos massacre. During trial proceedings, evidence demonstrated that Grupo Colina operated under state authority and that Fujimori exercised command responsibility. In 2009, a Peruvian court convicted Alberto Fujimori of crimes against humanity and sentenced him to 25 years in prison. Vladimiro Montesinos was also convicted on multiple charges related to corruption and human rights abuses. The convictions established formal accountability for state-sponsored violence carried out during the conflict. The 25-year sentence imposed on Fujimori marked a significant precedent in international law, as it represented the conviction of a former democratically elected head of state for human rights violations within his own country. The ruling was cited globally in discussions of command responsibility and accountability for state actors. In December 2023, Fujimori was granted a humanitarian pardon due to health considerations, generating public debate within Peru. Families of the victims continued to commemorate those killed in Barrios Altos, emphasizing recognition and accountability. The case remained a defining moment in Peru's confrontation with its past and the limits of state power during internal conflict. Case 6. November 20, 1991, Vukovar, Croatia. Over 200 patients and civilians were removed from Vukovar Hospital following the city's fall to Yugoslav and Serbian forces. The first signs of trouble appeared when buses arrived under military supervision, and individuals were separated inside the hospital corridors. What was presented as an evacuation quickly shifted in tone. Within days, attention turned toward Yugoslav People's Army officers overseeing the operation. After the siege of Vukovar ended on November 18, military personnel and paramilitary groups entered the hospital facility. Patients, wounded soldiers, medical staff, and civilians sheltering in the basement were ordered to assemble. Officials claimed they were being transferred for processing under prisoner of war regulations. Instead, groups of men were separated and placed on buses guarded by armed soldiers. The convoy traveled to the Ovčara agricultural farm outside Vukovar. Upon arrival, detainees were confined inside a hangar and subjected to beatings. Later that day, groups were taken from the building to a nearby ravine. There, executions were carried out. At least 200 individuals were killed in a series of shootings that continued into the evening. The victims included wounded Croatian soldiers receiving treatment, hospital staff who had remained during the siege, and civilians who had sought refuge in the facility. Vukovar Hospital had continued operating throughout the 87-day siege, treating patients under shelling and limited supplies. International humanitarian law protects medical facilities and those receiving care within them. Despite these protections, individuals were removed without formal registration or oversight by international observers. Many families initially believed their relatives were being transferred to detention camps. Instead, they disappeared without communication. The removal from a functioning hospital marked a transition from combat operations to detention outside lawful procedures. The scope of the removal indicated coordinated military involvement rather than spontaneous violence. In the months following the massacre, reports from survivors and witnesses began to circulate. In 1992, forensic teams located a mass grave at Ovčara containing the remains of those taken from the hospital. Exhumations confirmed execution-style gunshot wounds. International investigators from the United Nations and later the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia collected evidence and testimonies. Documentation linked the operation to officers of the Yugoslav People's Army and associated paramilitary units. Command structures were examined to determine responsibility for authorizing and supervising the transfer and subsequent killings. The discovery of the mass grave provided material evidence supporting survivor accounts and established grounds for international prosecution. Indictments were issued by the ICTY against several individuals connected to the operation, including Colonel Mile Markashik, Major Veselin Shchekeljivanchanin, and Captain Miroslav Radic. They were arrested and transferred to the Hague for trial. Proceedings examined their roles in ordering or facilitating the removal of detainees and failing to prevent their execution. In 2007, Markashik was convicted of aiding and abetting murder and torture and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Shchekeljivanchanin received a prison term following appeal adjustments. Radic was acquitted due to insufficient evidence linking him directly to the executions. The judgments established that the killings constituted serious violations of the laws of war. The convictions recognized the massacre as a war crime under international humanitarian law. Sentences of up to 20 years were imposed for aiding and abetting murder and torture. The case became one of the most significant prosecutions arising from the Croatian War of Independence. Commemorations continue annually in Vukovar, where memorials mark the site of the hospital and the Ovčara mass grave. The massacre remains central to regional discussions about accountability and reconciliation in the former Yugoslavia. While trials concluded for several senior officers, debates over responsibility and historical interpretation persist between communities affected by the conflict. Case 7. May 4, 1991, Singapore. Two people were found dead inside a residential apartment. The first signs of trouble appeared when police detained domestic worker Floor Contemplation, who had been present in the unit that morning. Authorities reported signs of violent death at the scene. Within days, attention turned toward her confession, which investigators described as detailed and voluntary. The bodies discovered belonged to Delia Maga, a fellow Filipino domestic worker, and 4-year-old Nicholas Huang, the child in the household. Maga had been strangled, and the child was found drowned in a basin. Police arrested Floor Contemplation shortly after the discovery, citing her presence in the apartment during the relevant time frame. According to official records, she provided a written confession admitting responsibility for both deaths. Authorities presented the motive as personal conflict involving jealousy and anger. The confession became the central element of the prosecution's case. From the outset, the investigation focused narrowly on her account rather than exploring broader alternative scenarios. Floor Contemplation was an overseas Filipino worker who had traveled to Singapore to support her family in the Philippines. Like many migrant domestic workers, she worked long hours under employment contracts that limited mobility and outside contact. Conditions for migrant workers in Singapore during that period were frequently discussed in both countries, particularly regarding isolation and legal vulnerability. Contemplation had been employed in domestic service and maintained friendships with other Filipino workers, including Delia Maga. Her arrest drew attention not only because of the severity of the charges, but also because of her status as a foreign worker subject to Singapore's legal system. The case quickly became intertwined with broader issues surrounding migrant labor protections. During trial proceedings, the prosecution relied primarily on Contemplation's confession. Forensic evidence was presented, but did not include conclusive physical proof directly linking her to both deaths beyond the statements she had provided. Defense counsel raised questions regarding the manner in which the confession had been obtained and the possibility of coercion. Alternative interpretations of the evidence emerged over time, including a theory suggesting that Delia Maga may have killed the child before taking her own life. However, these claims were not accepted by the Singapore court. The confession remained central to the conviction, and the trial advanced without substantial reconsideration of that alternative explanation. In January 1992, Floor Contemplation was convicted of double murder and sentenced to death by hanging under Singapore law. Appeals were filed but ultimately denied by the courts. Requests for clemency were submitted by Philippine officials as the execution date approached. Singapore authorities maintained that due process had been followed and that the evidence supported the conviction. The case drew increasing attention in the Philippines, where public demonstrations and appeals intensified. Despite diplomatic efforts, the sentence was upheld. The conviction became final following the exhaustion of available legal remedies within Singapore's judicial system. Floor Contemplation was executed on March 17, 1995, at Changi Prison. Her execution triggered widespread protests in the Philippines and led to a diplomatic crisis between the two countries. The Philippine government recalled its ambassador and conducted its own review of the case, raising concerns about evidentiary standards and confession procedures. Singapore rejected those criticisms and defended the integrity of its legal system. The incident prompted policy changes in the Philippines regarding legal assistance for citizens facing charges abroad. Debate over the fairness of the trial and the weight given to the confession continues in public discourse in both nations. Case 8. 2000-2003, China. multiple rural residents were found murdered across several provinces. The first signs of trouble appeared when police linked similar crime scenes in Henan, Hebei, Anhui, and Shandong. Victims had been attacked inside their homes during nighttime hours. The pattern suggested a single offender moving between regions. Within days of connecting forensic similarities, attention turned toward Yang Xinhai, a transient laborer with a prior criminal history. The earliest confirmed murders were discovered in rural Henan province, where entire households were found dead inside their homes. Victims had suffered blunt force trauma and stab wounds, and valuables were often taken. Similar scenes emerged in neighboring Hebei and Anhui provinces over the next 3 years. The attacks occurred at night, with entry gained through windows or unlocked doors. Survivors described a lone intruder armed with a hammer or heavy tool. As bodies accumulated, investigators noted the consistency in weapon type, method of entry, and selection of isolated villages. A pattern was formally established linking the killings across provincial jurisdictions, raising the possibility of a mobile serial offender. The victims were primarily farmers and rural families living in small villages with limited security. Many households consisted of elderly residents, couples, or extended family members. Yang Xinhai had previously been convicted of robbery and assault and had served prison time before the murders began. Following his release, he worked intermittently as a laborer, traveling between provinces for temporary employment. His transient background allowed him to move frequently without drawing sustained attention. Authorities later determined that he targeted remote residences to minimize the risk of witnesses or rapid police response. The combination of isolation and limited forensic resources in rural areas contributed to the extended duration of the crimes. Police forces across multiple provinces coordinated efforts, sharing forensic reports and suspect descriptions. Witness accounts described a man matching Yang's appearance seen near villages shortly before attacks. Investigators collected biological samples and physical evidence from crime scenes, including fingerprints and blood traces. In late 2003, Yang was identified and apprehended after investigative leads placed him in proximity to several recent incidents. During interrogation, he confessed to killing 67 people and assaulting numerous others between 2000 and 2003. His admissions aligned with the geographic spread and timeline established by investigators. The confession confirmed that the murders had been carried out by a single individual operating across provincial boundaries. Yang Xinhai was formally charged with multiple counts of intentional homicide. His trial was conducted in early 2004 in a Chinese Intermediate People's Court. Proceedings moved quickly, with prosecutors presenting his confession and supporting forensic evidence. The court convicted him on all counts. Given the scale and severity of the crimes, a death sentence was issued. Under Chinese criminal procedure, capital cases involving multiple murders are subject to mandatory review by the Supreme People's Court before execution. That review upheld the sentence. The legal process from arrest to sentencing concluded within months, reflecting the expedited handling of high-profile violent crimes within China's judicial framework. Yang Xinhai was executed by lethal injection in February 2004, following approval of his death sentence. Authorities characterized the case as one of the most severe serial murder cases in modern Chinese history. Official reporting emphasized the swift resolution and elimination of the threat. The case highlighted challenges in rural law enforcement coordination and the vulnerability of isolated communities. Although public discussion remained limited compared to Western media coverage of serial crimes, the magnitude of the killings placed Yang among the most prolific offenders documented in China. The legal proceedings concluded without extended appeals, closing one of the country's most extensive homicide investigations. Case 9. July 25, 2008, Pilibhit, Uttar Pradesh. 2 men were reported killed in what police described as an armed encounter on the outskirts of the district. According to the official version, the suspects opened fire during an attempted arrest. The first signs of trouble appeared when families claimed the victims had already been taken into custody days earlier. Within days, attention turned toward the officers involved in the operation. Police stated that the 2 men were intercepted near a rural stretch of road, and that a gunfight ensued when they attempted to flee. Officers reported returning fire in self-defense, resulting in both suspects being killed at the scene. Weapons were allegedly recovered beside the bodies. However, forensic examination raised questions. Ballistic trajectories and close-range injury patterns suggested the shots were not consistent with an active firefight. Families insisted the men had been detained prior to the reported encounter and had not been armed. Allegations emerged that the scene had been staged, with weapons planted and reports fabricated to justify the killings. The discrepancies prompted demands for an independent review of the incident. The victims were young men from the local community with minor criminal records but no history of violent offenses of the scale alleged. Uttar Pradesh had faced ongoing public pressure to address crime rates, and police performance was often measured by visible results. In that environment, encounters were sometimes presented as decisive actions against criminal activity. Community members questioned whether the 2 men had been targeted to demonstrate enforcement success. Relatives maintained that the victims were taken for questioning and never formally charged before their deaths. The broader context included documented concerns from human rights organizations about extrajudicial practices in parts of the state. Following public outcry, the case was transferred to the Central Bureau of Investigation. Investigators analyzed call detail records, duty rosters, and ballistic reports. Phone records indicated coordination among officers prior to the reported time of the encounter. Forensic specialists concluded that the evidence did not support claims of a mutual exchange of fire. Witnesses reported seeing the men in police custody before the alleged shootout. The CBI reconstructed the sequence of events, concluding that the victims had been detained and later taken to a remote location. The inquiry identified a pattern of similar staged encounters linked to certain officers operating in the region. Several police officers were formally charged with murder, criminal conspiracy, and destruction of evidence. The trial extended over years as testimony, forensic analysis, and documentation were presented in court. Prosecutors argued that the encounter had been deliberately staged to portray the deaths as lawful self-defense. Defense counsel contested the interpretation of ballistic findings and witness reliability. The court examined evidence including call records and reconstructed timelines, demonstrating coordination, inconsistent with an unplanned confrontation. The proceedings highlighted systemic concerns regarding accountability within law enforcement agencies and the evidentiary standards required to prove a staged encounter. In 2019, a court in Uttar Pradesh convicted multiple officers involved in the Pilibhit case and sentenced them to life imprisonment. The verdict marked a rare instance of convictions in an alleged fake encounter case. Appeals were filed, and portions of the legal process continued in higher courts. The ruling intensified national debate about extrajudicial killings and police accountability. Human rights organizations cited the case as precedent for independent investigation of similar incidents. The controversy surrounding encounter practices remained active in public discourse, with ongoing scrutiny of law enforcement methods in the state. Case 10. October 21, 1991, Basin, Croatia. At least 12 civilians were executed in their village during the armed conflict that followed Croatia's declaration of independence. The first signs of trouble appeared when armed paramilitaries entered the settlement at dawn and began moving house to house. Residents were ordered outside at gunpoint. Within days, Attention turned towards Serbian forces operating in the region under the authority of local political and military leadership. Witness accounts later described how armed men gathered villagers in the early morning hours. Men were separated from women and elderly residents were removed from their homes. Some victims were lined up near the center of the village and shot at close range. Others were killed inside their houses. After the shootings, several homes were looted and set on fire. Survivors were forced to leave the area, walking toward Croatian-controlled territory. By the time the attackers withdrew, at least 12 civilians were dead. The operation appeared organized and deliberate rather than the result of spontaneous combat. The killings occurred in an area with no active battlefield presence at the time. The victims were primarily elderly Croatian civilians who had remained in Basin during escalating tensions between Croat and Serb communities. The village was located in a region marked by shifting control as Yugoslavia disintegrated. Ethnic divisions intensified throughout 1991, with armed groups targeting settlements based on nationality. Basin had no strategic military installations, and those killed were not engaged in armed resistance. The broader context involved campaigns aimed at altering the demographic composition of contested territories. The removal and killing of civilians formed part of a pattern documented in several nearby communities during the same period. After Croatian forces regained access to the area, investigators began documenting the scene and collecting witness statements. Mass grave sites were identified near the village, and exhumations confirmed execution-style gunshot wounds. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia opened inquiries into crimes committed in the region. Evidence gathered from Basin was linked to a broader campaign of ethnic cleansing carried out in parts of Croatia in 1991 and 1992. Prosecutors examined command structures and operational orders to determine responsibility for actions committed by paramilitary and territorial defense units operating under political authority. Milan Martic, a senior political and military leader of the self-proclaimed Serbian Autonomous Region of Krajina, was indicted by the ICTY for crimes including persecution, murder, and inhumane acts committed in Croatia. Although the indictment covered multiple incidents across the region, evidence presented during trial proceedings referenced operations affecting villages such as Basin. In 2007, Martic was convicted and sentenced to 35 years in prison for his role in a joint criminal enterprise aimed at forcibly removing non-Serb civilians. Additional regional prosecutions were pursued against lower-ranking participants where sufficient evidence existed. The 35-year sentence imposed on Martic established accountability at the leadership level for crimes committed during the conflict. Basin became one of several sites memorialized annually to honor civilians killed in 1991. The massacre is recognized as a war crime within the broader framework of the Yugoslav wars. Survivors and families continue to participate in commemorative events. Discussions regarding responsibility and reconciliation remain ongoing in Croatia and Serbia. While legal proceedings addressed senior officials, many individual perpetrators were never identified or prosecuted, leaving aspects of the case unresolved decades later. Case 1. On September 2, 2019, in Elkmont, Alabama, deputies responded to a home where 5 members of the Sisk family were found dead from gunshot wounds. 14-year-old Mason Sisk, the only surviving son, reported that an unknown intruder had entered the residence and opened fire. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when they examined the exterior and noted that all entry points were intact. Within days, attention turned toward Mason as inconsistencies surfaced in his account. The case began in the early morning hours when a 911 call was placed reporting a shooting inside the Sisk residence. Deputies arrived at approximately 11:00 p.m. and found 5 victims, the father, the stepmother, and 3 young siblings. No signs of forced entry were documented, and the layout of the scene indicated the gunfire originated entirely within the home. Mason told responding deputies that he had been in the basement playing video games when he heard shots and observed an intruder fleeing in a vehicle. The statement prompted an initial canvass of the surrounding area, but no suspicious individuals or vehicles were located. As investigators reconstructed the scene, the trajectory patterns and intact doors created doubts about the reported escape route, but the evidence at the scene didn't match the initial story. The victims included 38-year-old John Sisk, his wife Mary Sisk, and their 3 children, all under the age of 15. Relatives later reported long-standing household tensions and frequent arguments between family members, noting that the environment had become increasingly strained in recent months. John Sisk worked locally and maintained limited community ties, while Mary oversaw the household and the children's routines. Extended relatives described disruptions in the home dynamic that had caused concern, but had not led to formal intervention. Mason, who had alternated between biological and blended family homes during childhood, lived under rules that some relatives said created friction. The family maintained limited outside involvement, and the household structure appeared stable from the exterior. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives began examining Mason's account, comparing his statements with physical evidence and recorded timelines. Several inconsistencies emerged, including discrepancies about the direction of gunfire, the supposed escape vehicle, and his actions before contacting authorities. Ballistic analysis indicated the shots were fired from inside the residence using a family-owned handgun. Investigators also documented that no external footprints, tire tracks, or disturbed soil supported the intruder claim. Digital data, including timestamp communications and Mason's movements inside the home, further narrowed the window of opportunity, placing him in proximity to the victims at key points in the timeline. During subsequent questioning, inconsistencies intensified, prompting investigators to apply additional scrutiny to his narrative. Then a single security camera revealed what had really happened. The breakthrough occurred when detectives confronted Mason with the combined ballistic, digital, and physical evidence contradicting his version of events. Investigators reported that the juvenile eventually admitted responsibility during a recorded statement, acknowledging there had been no intruder and that he had staged the initial report. He was arrested and later charged with multiple counts of capital murder. Prosecutors filed motions to try him as an adult based on the severity of the offenses and the number of victims involved. Detention records detailed Mason's behavior following the arrest, including attempts to alter his earlier explanations. His legal status shifted as hearings progressed, solidifying the decision to proceed under adult criminal statutes. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. During trial proceedings, prosecutors presented forensic evidence, confession details, and analyses of the weapon used in the homicides. Defense counsel focused on the defendant's age and developmental factors, raising questions about juvenile culpability in cases involving severe charges. The jury found Mason guilty of capital murder on multiple counts. Because he was a juvenile at the time of the offense, sentencing options were limited. The court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Subsequent appellate challenges argued issues surrounding interrogation methods and juvenile sentencing standards, but appellate courts upheld the conviction and the penalty. Public discussion continued regarding motive, with analysts citing household tensions, while others argued the case lacked a definitive psychological explanation. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators. Case 2. On February 18, 1988, 4 members of the Brahm family were discovered deceased inside their Rochester, Minnesota home. The only son unaccounted for was 16-year-old David Brahm, whose absence immediately drew the attention of investigators. According to early accounts at his school, peers had circulated rumors that David had spoken about harming his family the night before, pushing detectives to examine his whereabouts more closely. While the scene provided few external clues, the missing son and surrounding conversations quickly narrowed the field of focus toward him. The case began when school officials reported that David had unexpectedly failed to attend classes, prompting welfare concerns that led authorities to conduct a check at the Brahm residence. Police entered the home and found the parents and two siblings deceased, each showing signs of extensive blunt force trauma consistent with an axe attack. No forced entry was observed anywhere in the house, and nothing suggested a break-in or outside intrusion. Investigators documented undisturbed doors, intact windows, and no exterior footprints that would indicate an unknown offender. The interior layout and lack of disturbance reinforced the conclusion that the attacker was someone inside the home. With no evidence pointing outward, and the lone missing family member unaccounted for, the scene raised more questions than answers. The victims were Bernard and Paulette Brahm and two of their younger children, forming a family that, from the outside, appeared stable and private. Background interviews with relatives and acquaintances revealed recent tensions between David and his father, including reported disagreements over rules, discipline, and school behavior. Those who knew the family noted that arguments had escalated in the weeks leading up to the murders, creating a volatile dynamic beneath an otherwise ordinary household surface. David had struggled socially and academically, and several accounts described rising frustration that had not been addressed through formal intervention. As investigators pieced together the family's history, tensions within the home became a central area of inquiry. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives conducted a full search of the residence and recovered a blood-stained axe believed to be the murder weapon, located in an area consistent with internal access rather than forced entry. Investigators began interviewing classmates, who reported that David had made troubling statements about hurting his family shortly before the murders. These witness accounts aligned with the scene's physical evidence, strengthening the theory that the assailant was a family member. Forensic examinations confirmed that the wounds were consistent with the recovered weapon, further reinforcing the investigative direction. As authorities traced David's movements after he left home, additional statements surfaced from peers who claimed he had described the killings directly. Then, testimony from key witnesses revealed what had really happened. The breakthrough occurred when police located David after tracking peer disclosures and situational leads indicating he had spent time with friends following the murders. He was taken into custody, and during early stages of legal processing, the defense raised an insanity argument, asserting significant psychological instability at the time of the offense. Prosecutors countered with physical evidence, witness statements, and behavioral patterns documented before and after the killings. Evaluations were conducted, but examiners ultimately determined he was capable of understanding his actions. The insanity defense was rejected, and David was formally charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. When confronted with the collective evidence, the case moved rapidly into the trial phase. Court proceedings resulted in convictions on 4 counts of first-degree murder, leading to the imposition of multiple life sentences under Minnesota law. For years, Brahm remained incarcerated with parole eligibility projected decades into the future. Later legislative changes in Minnesota restructured juvenile sentencing for offenders convicted of severe crimes, enabling limited forms of structured work-release placements for long-term inmates. These policy adjustments allowed David to transition into a supervised halfway house program under strict monitoring. Public response to his change in custody status remained divided, with ongoing debates about the balance between rehabilitation and accountability. To this day, the case remains a reference point in discussions of juvenile offenders convicted of extreme violence. Case 3. On May 21, 1998, police discovered that William and Faith Kinkle had been shot inside their Springfield, Oregon home. The following morning, a shooting erupted at Thurston High School, where 2 students were killed and many others wounded. The suspect was apprehended alive after being tackled by classmates. When authorities connected incidents, the timeline showed that the school attack occurred less than a day after the killings at the family residence. Investigators immediately began piecing together the link between the 2 scenes and the suspect's movements. The case began the previous day, on May 20, when Kip Kinkle was detained at school for bringing a stolen handgun onto campus. He was suspended and sent home pending disciplinary action. Later that evening, his parents were shot inside their home. Their bodies were discovered only after the school shooting the next morning, when officers checked the residence as part of the unfolding investigation. The timeline suggested the homicides occurred shortly after Kip returned home from school authorities' custody. The absence of forced entry, combined with the earlier firearm incident, formed the initial framework for investigators assessing the events. As details emerged, the sequence made it clear that both incidents were connected. The victims were Kinkle's parents, who for years had attempted to manage their son's escalating behavioral and psychiatric issues. They sought professional evaluations, followed treatment plans, and monitored medications intended to stabilize symptoms related to paranoia and intrusive thoughts. School counselors and specialists had provided input, documenting the family's efforts to address emerging risks. Despite interventions, Kip's fascination with firearms, explosives, and violent ideation intensified over time. His parents maintained structured rules around weapons and discipline, trying to limit access while supporting treatment. Their ongoing attempts to manage his condition reflected broader concerns within the household. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives recovered multiple weapons used in both the homicides and the school shooting, including rifles, pistols, knives, and ammunition. A search of the Kinkle home uncovered journals, writings, and digital materials indicating sustained preoccupation with violence, self-harm, and mass casualty fantasies. Entries referenced perceived threats, delusional beliefs, and detailed plans that pointed toward premeditation rather than spontaneous action. Investigators also located evidence of homemade explosive devices and components consistent with bomb making. These materials aligned with concerns previously noted by school staff and mental health professionals. Forensic analysis connected the recovered firearms to rounds used in the attacks. Then, journal entries revealed what had really happened. Kinkle was apprehended at the high school after students overpowered him during the shooting and held him until police arrived. Once in custody, he was transported to a secure facility and evaluated. Prosecutors charged him with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Early in the proceedings, Kinkle entered guilty pleas, avoiding a protracted trial on factual disputes. The legal focus shifted to sentencing, where mental health considerations were presented alongside the severity of the offenses. Expert evaluations documented serious psychiatric conditions, but these findings did not alter the statutory requirements tied to the crimes. When confronted with the evidence in court, the case moved directly into sentencing. He received a sentence totaling 111 years in prison without the possibility of parole, structured through consecutive terms mandated under Oregon's Measure 11 sentencing laws. Defense appeals argued that the punishment for a juvenile offender violated evolving standards for sentencing minors, particularly given documented psychiatric impairments. Appellate courts rejected these challenges, upholding both the conviction and the sentence across multiple rulings. Kinkle remains incarcerated under current Oregon law, with no parole mechanism available. Legal filings seeking resentencing continue periodically, but have not altered his status. To this day, the case remains central in discussions surrounding juvenile offenders convicted of extreme violence. Case 4. On January 25, 2019, deputies conducting a welfare check at the Amato family home in Chuluota, Florida, discovered 3 deceased individuals inside the residence. The surviving son, 29-year-old Grant Amato, was later located at a hotel several miles away. Initial observations inside the house suggested elements of staging, including the positioning of a firearm near one of the victims. According to investigators, the first signs of concern emerged when inconsistencies appeared between the scene layout and the narrative offered by the surviving family member. Within days, attention shifted toward Grant as evidence developed. The case began when relatives were unable to contact the family and requested authorities perform a welfare visit. Inside the residence, deputies found the bodies of Chad, Margaret, and their older son, Cody Amato. All 3 had been shot, with the weapon placed near Cody's body in a manner consistent with a staged murder-suicide. The crime scene indicated the homicides occurred on the night of January 24. No signs of forced entry were documented, and the interior conditions suggested the victims had been attacked at close range. Forensic patterns contradicted the initial appearance of a self-inflicted gunshot. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, digital and physical discrepancies accumulated. But the staged elements inside the home did not match the initial implication. The victims were Grant's parents and his brother, all of whom had supported him financially during ongoing issues related to unemployment and debt. Relatives later reported that the family had attempted multiple interventions after discovering Grant had spent large sums of money on an online webcam model. Financial records showed continuous transfers and escalating theft from family accounts. The parents had recently imposed limits on funding and required Grant to seek treatment for compulsive online spending. Cody, who had also contributed financially, experienced significant loss due to Grant's siphoning of funds. These issues produced friction within the household, building tension over financial strain and broken trust. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from nearby locations, revealing Grant's movements before and after the time of death. Banking logs documented extensive transactions associated with the defendant's online activity, confirming motive and financial conflict. Forensic ballistics identified the firearm as one belonging to a family member, not consistent with an external assailant. Digital forensics uncovered attempts to manipulate devices and accounts following the victims' deaths, including online logins using a deceased parent's fingerprint. Additional analysis exposed inconsistencies in Grant's explanations regarding arrival times, phone activity, and the placement of the gun near Cody's body. Then, the combined digital and forensic evidence revealed what had really happened. Grant was located at a hotel and detained for questioning, as inconsistencies continued to accumulate. Investigators confronted him with contradictions between his statements and the physical and digital evidence recovered from the home. As the forensic analysis strengthened the connection between Grant and the homicides, authorities charged him with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Court documents detailed financial motive, scene staging indicators, and post-offense behavior that aligned with deliberate concealment rather than self-defense or external threat. When confronted with the compiled evidence, prosecutors moved the case toward trial on all counts. During trial proceedings, the state pursued the death penalty based on multiple victims and premeditation. Jurors reviewed forensic documentation, surveillance reconstruction, and financial evidence outlining the defendant's thefts and escalating behavior. The defense presented mitigation arguments noting Grant's lack of prior criminal history, but did not dispute key forensic findings. The jury did not reach unanimous agreement on imposing death, which under Florida law required unanimity. As a result, the court sentenced Grant Amato to life without the possibility of parole. His conviction was later reviewed and affirmed on appeal. To this day, the the case remains a reference point in discussions of digital-driven violence and family-related homicides. Case 5. On December 10, 2003, the Whitaker family returned to their Sugar Land, Texas home after having dinner to celebrate what they believed was their son Bart's upcoming college graduation. As they walked inside, shots were fired at close range. Kevin Whitaker and his mother, Patricia, were killed instantly, while the father, Kent, survived with severe injuries. Bart, who had remained briefly outside, claimed an intruder ambushed the family. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when the scene showed signs of staging. Within days, attention shifted toward Bart. The case began the moment the family entered the residence. The shooting unfolded quickly, with the attacker striking from a position consistent with prior access to the home. Bart re-entered seconds later, presenting a gunshot wound to his arm that investigators later noted appeared superficial and consistent with staging. Kent Whitaker was transported to a hospital in critical condition. Inside the home, police observed no forced entry, undisturbed windows, and an alarm system that had not been breached. These details conflicted with the image of an unknown intruder lying in wait. As detectives examined shell casings and entry patterns, disparities between Bart's account and the physical evidence mounted. But the staged intrusion did not match the initial story. The victims were Patricia and Kevin Whitaker, a mother and son deeply involved in their church and community, and Kent Whitaker, a respected businessman. The family had gathered earlier that evening to celebrate Bart's alleged graduation, unaware he had dropped out semesters earlier. Bart had maintained an elaborate deception about his academic life, complete with fabricated documents and false milestones. Relatives later reported that the family had invested emotionally and financially in his education, unaware of the extent of his misrepresentations. The planned celebration amplified their sense of pride and trust. Investigators later established that Bart orchestrated the evening to create a predictable timeline. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. During the investigation, authorities uncovered evidence indicating the attack was not spontaneous. A duffel bag containing critical materials, firearms, clothing, and other items was recovered from a lake, linking the crime to accomplices Bart had recruited. Accomplice testimony revealed that Bart had planned the attack for months, previously attempting to enlist others before settling on the final group. Investigators documented communication trails, financial arrangements, and earlier failed attempts that established a clear pattern of planning. Forensic evidence linked the recovered weapon to the crime scene, and law enforcement determined that Bart had provided access codes and keys to facilitate the shooter's entry. Then, accomplice statements revealed what had really happened. The breakthrough came when the shooter, Chris Brashear, confessed to authorities, identifying Bart as the architect of the plan. Investigators also located the third participant, Stephen Champagne, whose statements corroborated the timeline. Bart had fled to Mexico after suspicion grew, prompting cooperation between U.S. and Mexican authorities. He was arrested, extradited, and charged with capital murder based on his role in orchestrating the killings. Prosecutors built their case around premeditation, motive, and Bart's central involvement in the planning. When confronted with accomplice confessions, forensic findings, and documented evidence, the legal framework moved swiftly toward trial. Bart Whitaker was convicted of capital murder, and the jury sentenced him to death, noting the deliberate planning and multiple victims. His accomplices received lesser sentences. Brashear received life imprisonment, and Champagne received 15 years. Years later, Bart's father, Kent, publicly opposed his execution, advocating for clemency despite being a victim himself. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles eventually recommended commuting the sentence, and in 2018, the governor replaced Bart's death sentence with life without parole. The decision generated significant public debate about forgiveness, proportional sentencing, and the role of surviving victims in capital cases. To this day, the case remains a point of ongoing discussion. Case 6. On April 18, 1991, an Italian couple was found murdered inside their home in Montecchia di Crosara, Veneto. Their son, 19-year-old Pietro Masso, appeared at the scene showing limited visible distress, drawing early attention from investigators. According to the initial assessment, the lack of forced entry and the controlled nature of the environment suggested an internal offender rather than an outside intruder. As authorities gathered statements and reviewed Pietro's behavior, inconsistencies emerged. Within days, suspicion shifted toward him as details surrounding motive and conduct became clearer. The case began the night before, when Antonio Masso and his wife, Maria Rosa, returned home from a church-related meeting. As they entered the darkened residence, they were attacked with blunt objects wielded by multiple individuals waiting inside. The assault was highly targeted, with no signs of struggle elsewhere in the home and no evidence of robbery or forced access. Investigators documented that the lighting had been manipulated, likely to disorient the victims upon entry. The attackers fled shortly afterward, while Pietro created an alibi by spending part of the night out with acquaintances. When he reported discovering their bodies, the timeline and staged emotional presentation did not align with the scene. But the details of the nighttime attack raised immediate questions. The victims were members of a middle-class household known for financial stability and strong community involvement. Their son, Pietro, had been expressing dissatisfaction with his lifestyle and sought rapid financial independence. Relatives later shared that Pietro displayed increasing interest in luxury items, nightlife, and social status, none of which aligned with his actual means. Investigators learned that he had grown frustrated with the pace of his personal financial progress and had spoken openly about wanting access to family resources sooner rather than later. Friends noted remarks suggesting entitlement to the family's assets. As authorities explored the family's dynamics, Pietro's financial focus became central. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. As detectives questioned Pietro's social circle, accomplices began cooperating with law enforcement. Their accounts revealed that the murders were not spontaneous, but the result of multiple earlier plots, including discussions of poisoning, staged burglaries, and planned explosions. These prior attempts had failed due to logistical issues or second thoughts among the group. Evidence showed that Pietro had assumed the leadership role, coordinating meetings, arranging tools, and assigning responsibilities for the final plan. Investigators also uncovered discarded materials and communications documenting planning sessions. The consistencies across accomplice statements aligned closely with the crime scene and timeline. Then, the coordinated testimonies revealed what had really happened. Police arrested Pietro after accomplice confessions directly implicated him as the planner and primary motivator behind the attack. Under questioning, participants described Pietro's central role in recruiting them with promises of financial gain after the inheritance transferred. Authorities formally charged him with double murder, supported by physical evidence and cooperative testimony. The other members of the group received separate charges proportional to their involvement. Pietro's conduct following the murders, including attempts to maintain a casual demeanor and inquiries about property matters, further reinforced prosecutorial arguments. When confronted with the accumulated statements and evidence, the case advanced rapidly toward trial. Pietro received a 30-year sentence, the maximum allowed under Italian law at the time for his age category. His accomplices received reduced terms based on roles and cooperation. While imprisoned, Pietro participated in rehabilitation programs and later became eligible for semi-liberty, allowing limited work release conditions during daytime hours. In 2013, after sentence reductions and good behavior credits, he was granted full release. The decision sparked national controversy, with public debate centered on sentencing limits, rehabilitation frameworks, and proportional punishment in cases involving parricide. Discussions continued as the case became emblematic of broader concerns about juvenile and young adult sentencing in serious violent crimes. Case 7. In September 2004, authorities responding to a welfare request entered a home near Maitland, Florida, and found two women deceased inside, Terry Brandt and her niece, Michelle Jones. A male relative, Terry's husband, Charlie Brandt, was also located in the residence, dead by suicide in the garage. According to investigators, the first signs of concern appeared when family members reported unanswered calls and unusual silence. Within hours of discovery, attention shifted toward Charlie as the only individual capable of committing the homicides before taking his own life. The case began when friends became alarmed after failing to reach Michelle Jones for several days. Deputies conducting the welfare check entered the residence and discovered Michelle and Terry with injuries consistent with sharp force trauma. Charlie was found hanged in a separate area of the home, and evidence indicated the sequence was a double homicide followed by suicide. The interior scene showed no signs of forced entry, robbery, or outside intrusion. The layout and controlled environment indicated the victims were attacked inside a familiar space. As investigators examined the remains and scene characteristics, the precision and severity of the injuries drew immediate attention. But the welfare entry revealed a homicide-suicide sequence with deeper implications. The victims were Charlie's wife, Terry, and her niece, Michelle, with whom they were staying temporarily during a hurricane evacuation. As authorities documented the scene, Charlie's background was re-examined, revealing a juvenile case from 1971 in which he fatally shot his pregnant mother and critically injured his father in Indiana at age 13. He had been committed to a psychiatric facility, but was released after approximately 1 year, with limited supervision thereafter. For decades, he lived without known violent incidents, maintaining employment and relationships without raising suspicion. The connection between the 1971 case and the 2004 homicides emerged only after his death, reshaping perceptions of his past. It would take only days for their quiet lives to unravel. Investigators began analyzing the home and Charlie's possessions, uncovering anatomical drawings, medical references, and digital searches focused on autopsies and dissection. These materials indicated long-term preoccupation with anatomical study beyond casual interest. Detectives also reviewed unsolved homicides in Florida, identifying similarities between Michelle's injuries and those in a 1989 case involving Sherry Purr Isho, whose death had remained unresolved. Forensic comparisons and behavioral pattern assessments linked wound characteristics and offender knowledge to Charlie. These parallels prompted a broader review of cold cases in surrounding counties. Then, the reconstructed pattern revealed what had really happened. Although Charlie was deceased, investigators proceeded with post-mortem analysis of his possible involvement in additional crimes. The most significant breakthrough occurred when authorities formally connected him to the 1989 Perisho homicide, citing matching injury patterns and geographic proximity to his residence at the time. With no living offender to charge, the cold case was administratively closed, naming Charlie as the responsible party. Law enforcement publicly stated that he may have committed additional homicides based on similarities in victim injuries and his access to isolated areas, though no further cases were definitively proven. When confronted with the cumulative evidence, agencies classified the pattern as consistent with serial offending. There was no trial due to Charlie's suicide, leaving many questions unresolved. Investigators maintained that his juvenile matricide, combined with the 1989 and 2004 homicides, formed a probable serial pattern spanning decades. Public records reflect uncertainty regarding how many victims may have been involved, as evidence gaps and the absence of direct forensic links limited definitive conclusions. Analysts continue to reference the case in discussions of undetected long-term offenders and the challenges of identifying violent histories when juvenile records are sealed or minimized. Although no formal conviction followed, the investigative findings established a pattern that remains significant in criminal case studies. Case 8. On August 20, 1989, Jose and Kitty Menendez were found shot to death in the den of their Beverly Hills home. Their adult sons, Lyle and Eric, reported discovering the bodies after returning to the residence. According to early assessments, the brutality of the attack and the couple's financial status led investigators to consider the possibility of a professional hit. The brothers displayed emotional reactions, but provided limited detail about events prior to the shooting. As inconsistencies later emerged, attention gradually shifted toward them. The case began with a 911 call placed by the brothers reporting that their parents had been killed. Responding officers entered the home theater and found the victims with multiple shotgun wounds. The scene exhibited elements resembling an organized assault, including close-range firing and lack of robbery indicators. Initial theories suggested a retaliatory killing tied to business disputes involving Jose's entertainment and corporate ventures. Detectives documented the house as intact with no forced entry, and the presence of high-value items left untouched supported the idea of targeted intent. As timelines were reconstructed, however, discrepancies surfaced between the brothers' accounts and the scene dynamics. But the early assumption of a professional hit began to weaken as more details arose. The victims were Jose Menendez, a successful entertainment executive, and his wife Kitty, a former schoolteacher and actress. The family lived in a high-profile neighborhood and maintained an affluent lifestyle. Lyle and Eric, both in their late teens and early 20s, were enrolled in college but were also documented engaging in substantial discretionary spending. Their activities included expensive cars, luxury clothing, dining, and travel, with accounts indicating rapid expenditures following the deaths. Friends and associates noted ongoing family tensions involving expectations, performance pressure, and household dynamics. Investigators later evaluated these factors to contextualize broader motives. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. As the investigation progressed, authorities uncovered financial records showing the brothers significant post-homicide spending, including luxury purchases within weeks of the killings. Gun purchase documents linked Lyle to shotguns consistent with those used in the attack. The case advanced dramatically when taped therapy sessions with Eric's psychologist surfaced, containing disclosures about involvement in the homicides. Although legal battles surrounded admissibility, portions of the conversations became central to the investigation. Detectives also assembled timelines showing planning behaviors and the elimination of forced entry scenarios. Then, combined financial and testimonial evidence revealed what had really happened. Prosecutors convened a grand jury and secured indictments against both brothers, alleging coordinated planning and joint participation in the homicides. Lyle was arrested first, followed by Eric after returning from overseas. The trial featured joint proceedings, with the prosecution arguing shared motive and mutual action, while the defense presented claims involving long-term family dysfunction and abuse. The court evaluated ballistic evidence, financial activity, and the brothers' post-offense conduct. When confronted with the comprehensive evidence, the proceedings moved toward sequential jury deliberations. Both brothers were ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy charges. The sentencing court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, citing premeditation and financial motive. Numerous appeals followed, including challenges based on procedural issues, jury instructions, and the admissibility of therapeutic recordings. None resulted in overturning the convictions. Periodic public debate continues regarding the balance between the prosecution's financial motive theory and the defense's allegations of abuse within the household. To this day, the Menendez case remains one of the most widely discussed familial homicide prosecutions in the United States. Case 9. On July 15, 2001, three members of the Gonzalez family were found deceased inside their North Ryde home in Sydney. The surviving son, 20-year-old Seth Gonzalez, told police that he believed an unknown intruder had entered the residence and attacked his parents and sister. According to first responders, the lack of forced entry and the controlled condition of the interior raised early concerns about the plausibility of that account. As inconsistencies surfaced in Seth's statements, investigators focused increasingly on his role in the sequence of events. The case began when neighbors reported unusual quiet and observed the family car unmoved for a prolonged period. Police entering the home found the victims with multiple stab wounds and noted graffiti on the walls referencing racial motives. The placement of the messages and the manner of the attack suggested an intentional attempt to deflect suspicion toward an external hate-driven offender. No property was missing, and the house showed no signs of a struggle beyond the homicide area. The scene suggested staged indicators designed to imply an outsider's involvement. As investigators compared the physical evidence with the intruder claim, inconsistencies rapidly accumulated. But the staged graffiti would ultimately undermine the initial narrative. The victims were Seth's parents, Teddy and Mary Loiva Gonzalez, and his younger sister, Claudine, members of a migrant family known for academic diligence and strong community participation. The parents maintained high expectations for Seth's educational performance, providing structured support for university pursuits. Investigators learned that Seth had recently faced academic setbacks, including falsified grades and suspension notices concealed from his parents. Financial concerns involving future inheritance and projected career outcomes were examined as part of the broader context. Relatives and acquaintances reported rising tension within the household as Seth attempted to maintain the appearance of academic success. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. As detectives analyzed the evidence, numerous contradictions surfaced. Purchase records linked Seth to clothing, gloves, and items matching materials used during the offense. DNA traces found on clothing discarded in a public bin aligned with the family environment, undermining the intruder hypothesis. Surveillance footage and time-stamped receipts created discrepancies around Seth's stated movements, placing him at locations inconsistent with his alibi. Investigators also noted that items allegedly stolen by the supposed intruder were later found in Seth's possession. Collectively, the physical, digital, and forensic records revealed a timeline incompatible with his claims. Then, the cumulative evidence revealed what had really happened. Police arrested Seth after compiling the inconsistencies surrounding his narrative, supported by forensic and digital records. Prosecutors argued that the primary motive involved financial gain tied to significant inheritance, along with reputational concerns related to academic deception. Evidence presented at preliminary hearings included purchase histories, DNA testing, and behavioral analysis. Seth denied involvement, but inconsistencies in his statements and actions following the homicides weakened the defense. The prosecution emphasized deliberate staging, intent to mislead investigators, and steps taken to conceal academic failures. When confronted with the collective evidence, charges moved forward to trial. Seth was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The sentencing judge cited the severity of the crimes, the calculated staging, and the motive structure as justification for the penalty. Subsequent policy action by the New South Wales government removed any future parole eligibility, effectively ensuring permanent incarceration. Multiple appeals challenging CTS of forensic evidence and procedural decisions failed to overturn the conviction. The case remains a significant reference in discussions involving staged homicide scenes, inheritance motives, and academically driven familial conflict within immigrant households. Case 10. On November 15, 2004, police responding to a welfare request found Peter Porco deceased and his wife, Joan, critically injured inside their Delmer, New York residence. Early scene assessments showed severe blunt force trauma consistent with an axe attack. Surveillance footage and travel logs later placed their adult son, Christopher Porco, on a timeline linking him to the home during the critical overnight hours. According to investigators, the first signs of concern appeared when inconsistencies arose between Christopher's statements and documented movements. The case began when Peter Porco failed to appear at a courthouse where he worked, prompting colleagues to request a welfare check. Deputies arrived at the family home and discovered Peter in the entry area with fatal injuries, and Joan alive but gravely wounded in the bedroom. The suspected weapon, an axe, was recovered inside the residence, showing no signs of forced entry or struggle indicative of an outsider's break-in. The house appeared orderly, with no theft indicators, and the specific nature of the attack suggested familiarity with the victim's routines. As detectives reconstructed the overnight timeline, the controlled environment contradicted any intrusion scenario. But the welfare-triggered entry revealed deeper inconsistencies. The victims were long-standing community members known for their stable household and support for their adult sons. Investigators learned that Christopher had been receiving significant financial assistance from his parents, including payments for tuition, housing, and vehicle obligations. Records showed that he had engaged in forgery of his father's signature to secure loans and had continued deceptive practices involving university management and financial institutions. Behavioral issues, including misrepresentation of academic status and attempts to conceal debts, created mounting tension. These dynamics redirected investigative attention toward financial strain and interpersonal conflict. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives examined Christopher's movements through vehicle tracking, toll booth records, and surveillance footage captured along the interstate. These records indicated travel during the exact window in which the attack occurred. Investigators also reviewed financial data showing recent attempts to address escalating debts and forged documents involving his father's identity. Although no direct DNA or fingerprints placed him inside the home at the time of the attack, the circumstantial evidence aligned into a coherent timeline. Forensic analysis confirmed the weapon's placement and trajectory patterns consistent with an internal offender. Then, the compiled travel and financial records revealed what had really happened. Christopher was arrested and charged with second-degree murder for his father's death and attempted murder for the attack on his mother. Prosecutors argued that the motive stemmed from financial pressure, deception exposure, and escalating conflict with his parents. Bail was denied due to the severity of the allegations and the strength of the circumstantial framework. Defense counsel challenged the reliability of the circumstantial evidence, emphasizing the absence of direct forensic links. Nevertheless, the prosecution's timeline reconstruction, digital travel mapping, and financial documentation formed the core of the case. When confronted with the unified circumstantial structure, proceedings advanced to full trial. A jury convicted Christopher on all charges, resulting in 2 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life. Appeals challenged aspects of witness testimony, circumstantial methodology, and judicial rulings, but appellate courts upheld the conviction. Subsequent CPL 440 motions raised procedural and evidentiary issues, extending post-conviction litigation. Public interpretation of the case remains divided, with some citing the strength of circumstantial evidence and others questioning the absence of direct forensic proof. To this day, the Porco case is a prominent example of a homicide prosecution built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Case 1. June 23, 1981, New Ashford, Massachusetts. 15-year-old Laura Sheridan was reported abducted after accepting a ride home from a stranger while walking a familiar route from a bus stop. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when the vehicle slowed near her house but did not stop. Instead, it continued past her home. Within days, attention turned toward a local man whose movements and behavior during that evening raised early concern among responding authorities. The incident began in the late afternoon when Laura accepted a ride from a man offering to take her home. After passing her residence, the driver accelerated and refused to stop. When Laura sensed danger, she attempted to escape and pleaded to be released. Investigators later confirmed the man reached for a firearm concealed inside a paper bag, escalating the situation. A struggle followed inside the vehicle as Laura fought to regain control. The car eventually pulled off near Route 7 close to a rest area. Laura exited the vehicle and ran toward the roadway, drawing attention from passing motorists. One driver stopped to assist her, while another followed the fleeing vehicle long enough to record its license plate. Police were contacted shortly after, and Laura was transported to safety. But the evidence at the scene did not match the initial assumptions. At the time, Laura was a teenager following a routine common in small New England towns during the early 1980s. Hitchhiking short distances was not unusual, and familiarity with neighbors and local roads often replaced caution. Laura regularly walked the route from the bus stop to her home and had no prior history of incidents along the way. The community environment fostered trust, particularly toward adults offering assistance. That trust shaped the circumstances that allowed the crime to occur. Laura's family life and school routine reflected stability, making the incident appear sudden and uncharacteristic. It would take only days for her ordinary routine to become the focus of a serious criminal investigation. Law enforcement responded quickly after Laura reached safety. Officers collected her account, secured the area near Route 7, and followed up on the license plate information provided by a witness. The suspect was identified and charged with assault and weapons-related offenses. Investigators examined physical evidence and reconstructed the timeline of the attempted abduction. However, limitations in forensic methods and corroborating evidence weakened the case. During court proceedings, the defense challenged the reliability of available proof. As a result, the suspect was acquitted of the charges. With no conviction and no further evidence at the time, the case was effectively closed, leaving unresolved questions surrounding the attempted kidnapping. More than 4 decades later, advances in investigative techniques prompted renewed scrutiny. In 2024, prosecutors convened a grand jury to re-examine the events of June 23, 1981. Laura provided testimony recounting the incident, and investigators reviewed historical records alongside newly available information. Interstate coordination between Massachusetts and Vermont authorities allowed previously disconnected details to be reassessed. The renewed investigation established a clearer pattern of behavior linked to the suspect. Evidence that had once been insufficient was reevaluated in light of corroborating findings. When confronted with the accumulated record, the suspect agreed to resolve the case through a plea. In December 2025, the suspect pleaded guilty to kidnapping charges related to the 1981 incident. The court imposed a prison sentence to be served concurrently with an existing term from a separate conviction. The plea formally acknowledged responsibility for the crime, bringing legal resolution after decades of uncertainty. For investigators, the outcome closed a case that had remained incomplete for much of Laura's life. The proceedings underscored the lasting impact of delayed justice and the role of survivor testimony in reopening cold cases. Even after the sentence, the case remained a reference point in discussions about accountability across time. Case 2. September 18, 1986, Manchester, Vermont. 32-year-old golf professional Sarah Hunter was reported missing after failing to return home following a routine evening. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when her car was later located abandoned near a local gas station. The circumstances did not align with her habits or schedule. Within days, attention turned toward a gas station employee who had last seen her alive during the late-night hours. On the evening of September 18, Sarah left her boyfriend's residence intending to return home and prepare for an upcoming professional certification. Before doing so, she stopped at a gas station in Manchester to purchase cigarettes. The station was staffed by a Angli employee working the night shift. Investigators later determined that Sarah was forcibly restrained inside the station, bound with rope, and prevented from leaving. When the shift ended, she was forced into the trunk of a vehicle and driven south toward a remote area. She was not seen again that night. The following morning, September 19, she was reported missing by a coworker after failing to appear as expected. Her vehicle was eventually found abandoned, raising immediate concerns. But the evidence at the scene did not match the initial explanations. Sarah was a respected golf professional at the Manchester Country Club and was well known within the local community. She had helped develop junior golf programs and was regarded as dependable and disciplined in both her career and personal life. Her daily routines were consistent, and she maintained close contact with friends and coworkers. On the night she vanished, she had followed an ordinary pattern, making her disappearance especially concerning. There was no indication she planned to leave town or disrupt her schedule. Her role in the community and predictable habits shaped early assumptions that something had gone wrong rather than a voluntary absence. It would take only days for her stable, structured life to become the center of a major criminal investigation. Law enforcement focused early attention on the gas station where Sarah was last seen. David Allen Morrison, an employee working that shift, became a person of interest due to his proximity and opportunity. Investigators examined his background and movements and searched for physical evidence linking him to the disappearance. Despite these efforts, forensic limitations at the time prevented a direct connection. Hair and trace evidence could not be reliably matched, and no eyewitnesses placed Morrison with Sarah beyond the station. Without conclusive proof, prosecutors were unable to file charges. As months passed without new leads, the investigation stalled. The case gradually went cold, despite lingering suspicions surrounding the initial suspect. Decades later, advances in forensic science prompted renewed examination of the evidence. Investigators reevaluated preserved materials using modern DNA testing techniques. Interviews were reopened, and case files were reviewed with a fresh perspective. This process revealed inconsistencies in earlier forensic conclusions and allowed previously unusable evidence to be tested accurately. The results linked biological material from the crime scene to Morrison. Former investigators who had worked the case were consulted, and renewed pressure was applied. During a subsequent interview, Morrison admitted responsibility for Sarah's death, aligning his statement with the physical evidence that had finally been validated. In 2025, Morrison entered a guilty plea in connection with Sarah Hunter's murder. The court imposed a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The plea formally resolved a case that had remained unanswered for nearly 40 years. For Sarah's family and the community, the outcome marked the end of prolonged uncertainty. Investigators noted that the case demonstrated the consequences of early forensic limitations and the impact of later technological advances. With the conviction secured, the case was officially closed, concluding one of Vermont's longest-running unsolved murders. Case 3. July 20, 1990, Madison County, Illinois. An unidentified woman was found deceased in a soybean field near a rural intersection. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared with evidence indicating she had been killed elsewhere and later transported to the location. The condition of the body suggested violence and deliberate placement. Within days, the case stalled due to one missing element that prevented further progress: her identity. The discovery was made by a farmer working in the field who noticed a body lying among the crops. Law enforcement responded and secured the scene, documenting multiple stab wounds and signs that the victim had been deceased for approximately a week. Investigators determined the killing had likely occurred at another location before the body was left in the field. Items recovered included clothing, shoes, and jewelry, all cataloged for potential identification. The coroner preserved biological material in anticipation of future testing. Despite processing the scene and issuing alerts to surrounding jurisdictions, no immediate leads emerged. There were no witnesses, no vehicle sightings, and no missing person reports that matched the victim's description. But the evidence at the scene did not lead to a name. Without an identity, investigators faced immediate limitations. The woman appeared to be approximately 30 years old, but nothing else connected her to a known address, employer, or family. Her fingerprints were not on file, and no matching reports were located locally or nationally. Over time, she was assigned a Jane Doe designation and buried with a simple marker. Periodic reviews of the case produced no new information. Composite sketches were created and distributed, including a clay reconstruction released years later, but no credible identifications followed. As decades passed, the absence of a name prevented investigators from establishing her movements, relationships, or final hours. The case remained open but inactive, defined by unanswered questions rather than actionable leads. In later years, renewed interest in unresolved cases prompted Madison County authorities to revisit the file. Advances in forensic science offered tools that had not existed in 1990. The preserved biological evidence was submitted to state laboratories for modern analysis. Investigators partnered with specialized forensic genealogy teams to explore potential familial connections through DNA. This process involved building extended family trees using distant genetic matches. The work required months of verification, cross-referencing public records, and narrowing possibilities. State and federal agencies collaborated to confirm findings and rule out errors. Gradually, a profile emerged that suggested the victim's origins lay far from Illinois. In 2025, the genealogical investigation reached a conclusion. The unidentified woman was confirmed to be Winona Nadine Wendy Michael, born in 1959. Records showed she had lived in multiple states and traveled frequently. Investigators traced her last confirmed contacts to the months preceding her death, establishing a clearer timeline of her movements. Family members were located and notified after verification procedures were completed. The identification resolved the central barrier that had stalled the case for more than 3 decades. It also reopened questions that had never been answered, including where she was killed and who was responsible. Following the identification, authorities informed surviving relatives and provided details of the investigation. While the confirmation ended years of uncertainty about her fate, it did not resolve the homicide itself. Investigators acknowledged that critical gaps remained regarding her final days and the circumstances of her death. The case remained classified as an active homicide investigation, with appeals issued for information related to her travels and associations in 1990. For law enforcement, the identification marked progress rather than conclusion. The search for the individual responsible continued, decades after the crime first entered official records. Case 4. April 2, 1983, Louisville, Kentucky. 3-year-old Michelle Marie Newton was reported missing after her mother departed early with the child and failed to return from a claimed relocation trip. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when all communication abruptly stopped and no forwarding information was provided. The child did not arrive at any new address. Within days, attention turned toward Michelle's mother as the sole adult known to be with her when contact ended. The custodial disappearance began when Michelle's mother left the family residence with the child, stating she was traveling ahead to prepare housing and employment. When Michelle's father arrived later, both were gone and no destination could be confirmed. Law enforcement issued alerts and obtained an arrest warrant for custodial interference. Early efforts focused on tracing travel routes, relatives, and employment records, but no confirmed sightings followed. As years passed, the absence stretched into decades. The case remained open but produced no verified leads. Michelle grew from a missing toddler into an adult without authorities knowing her location. Despite periodic checks, the mother and child remained unaccounted for, and the disappearance became one of Kentucky's longest-running parental abduction cases. Michelle's early childhood had been spent with both parents before the sudden separation. After the disappearance, she was raised under a different name and identity, unaware of her biological father or the circumstances of her infancy. She attended school, formed relationships, and later built a family of her own without knowledge of her past. No records indicated she questioned her identity. Her upbringing occurred entirely outside official awareness, shaped by an assumed family history that did not reflect reality. The absence of a missing person report in her adult name prevented recognition. For decades, Michelle lived an ordinary life while remaining legally classified as missing. Over time, investigative limitations reduced active follow-up. In the early 2000s, the case was removed from some national databases due to stale information and lack of contact with reporting parties. Years later, renewed interest from extended family prompted authorities to reopen the file. Investigators re-entered the case into modern systems and coordinated with national organizations specializing in missing children. Age progression imagery was developed and distributed to reflect Michelle's likely adult appearance. These efforts aimed to generate public recognition and tips. Despite renewed attention, no immediate results followed, and the case continued without confirmation of her whereabouts. In 2025, a tip received by investigators identified a woman living under an alias in Florida whose appearance matched the age progression image. A joint task force reviewed records and obtained DNA for comparison. Testing confirmed a familial match linking the woman to Michelle's biological relatives. Authorities located and arrested Michelle's mother, who had been living under an assumed name for decades. The identification established that Michelle had been alive and residing in the United States throughout the entire period. The confirmation resolved the central mystery of her disappearance and formally ended her missing status. Following identification, arrangements were made for Michelle to reunite with her biological father, whom she had not seen since early childhood. The reunion occurred after more than 40 years of separation. Legal proceedings against her mother advanced on custodial interference charges, with no statute of limitations applicable. Michelle cooperated with authorities as the case moved forward. While the criminal process continued, investigators emphasized the significance of the recovery. The case closed with Michelle no longer classified as missing, marking the end of a decades-long parental abduction investigation. Case 5. February 19, 1986, Roseville, California. Human skull fragments were discovered along Dry Creek near Booth Road in an unincorporated area. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared with the inability to determine who the remains belonged to or how they arrived there. The limited condition of the remains prevented identification. Within years, the case faded from active investigation and entered long-term evidence storage without resolution. The remains were located by investigators conducting work near the creek bed. Only partial skeletal fragments were present, offering little information about the circumstances surrounding the death. At the time, forensic technology could not extract usable biological identifiers from the material recovered. No personal items were found nearby that could establish identity. Investigators documented the location, preserved the fragments, and entered the case into missing persons systems. However, without fingerprints, dental records, or viable DNA, comparisons yielded no matches. Early forensic limitations restricted conclusions about cause or manner of death. With no immediate leads and no reports that could be linked to the remains, the investigation stalled shortly after its initial phase. Years earlier, Marjorie Lahan had been reported missing in October 1982 in Sacramento County, California. She was 49 years old at the time and known to her family as a mother with creative interests and an active lifestyle. Her daily routines included artistic pursuits and outdoor activities. When she disappeared, no foul play was suspected, and no immediate indicators suggested a crime had occurred. Her absence did not initially generate a criminal investigation, and no connection was made between her disappearance and the remains found years later. Without confirmed evidence linking her to any crime scene, her case remained unresolved, gradually slipping from public attention. Decades later, the Placer County Cold Case Team initiated a review of unidentified remains held in evidence. Advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to re-examine cases previously thought unsolvable. The skull fragments recovered in 1986 were submitted to the California Department of Justice for renewed analysis. Specialists attempted modern extraction techniques capable of working with degraded samples. Investigators coordinated with forensic laboratories and reviewed missing persons cases from surrounding counties. This systematic effort aimed to establish identity rather than determine cause of death, recognizing that confirmation alone could bring long-delayed answers to families. In December 2025, forensic testing produced a successful DNA profile from the preserved remains. The profile was compared against genealogical databases and matched with a family member of Marjorie Lahan. Further verification confirmed that the remains belonged to her. The identification resolved a connection that had been missing for nearly 4 decades. Investigators formally linked the 1986 discovery to her 1982 disappearance, closing the question of her whereabouts. The breakthrough demonstrated the impact of renewed forensic analysis on long-standing cold cases. Following the identification, authorities notified Marjorie Lahan's family and updated official records. Due to the limited nature of the remains, investigators stated that no cause or manner of death could be determined. The case did not result in criminal charges, and no suspect was identified. Officials emphasized that the identification itself represented a significant outcome, providing clarity after decades of uncertainty. The case became part of a broader initiative supporting cold case reviews and forensic advancements, highlighting how modern techniques could restore names to those long unidentified. Case 6. January 24, 2006, Orlando, Florida. 24-year-old Jennifer Kess was reported missing after she failed to arrive at work and could not be reached by phone. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when her usual morning communication did not occur and her phone went unanswered. Family members immediately raised concerns. Within days, attention turned toward unidentified individuals later seen on limited security footage connected to her vehicle. Jennifer was last known to be at her condominium the night before her disappearance after returning from a weekend trip. She spoke with family members and her boyfriend that evening and made no indication of travel plans. The following morning, she did not send her customary message before work and did not appear at her job. Her employer contacted her parents, who attempted to reach her without success. They traveled to Orlando and found her condominium appearing as though she had left for work, with personal items still inside. Her car, phone, purse, and keys were missing. Police were contacted, and a missing person report was filed. Initial checks of nearby areas produced no immediate results, but the circumstances did not align with a voluntary absence. Jennifer was a finance professional who had recently purchased her first condominium. She maintained regular routines, consistent communication with family, and a structured work schedule. Her social circle was stable, and she was known to be cautious and organized. The condominium complex where she lived was undergoing renovations at the time, resulting in frequent access by construction and maintenance workers. Residents had previously reported discomfort related to some encounters in shared areas. Jennifer's predictable habits and stable lifestyle made her disappearance highly unusual. Her environment and routine became central to early investigative focus. It would take only hours for her normal morning pattern to be recognized as a significant warning sign. 2 days after her disappearance, Jennifer's vehicle was found parked at a nearby apartment complex approximately 1 mile from her residence. Security footage showed an unidentified individual exiting the car and walking away, but the person's face was obscured. The footage provided limited physical details and no definitive identification. Investigators searched the vehicle but found no conclusive forensic evidence. Early investigative opportunities were constrained by missing or incomplete security recordings from Jennifer's condominium complex. Multiple theories were considered, including abduction near her car and targeted contact by someone familiar with the property. Despite extensive searches and assistance from federal agencies, no arrest was made. Years later, advances in forensic review prompted renewed examination of preserved evidence. Previously untested DNA material was analyzed using modern techniques. Investigators revisited surveillance footage and applied AI-assisted enhancement tools to clarify physical features. The suspect pool was narrowed as outdated leads were reassessed and eliminated. The investigation shifted from a dormant status to an active review, with law enforcement confirming that new evidence had provided a more focused direction. While no arrest had been announced, officials stated that the case was no longer considered cold. Jennifer's family pursued civil action to obtain investigative records, resulting in the release of extensive documentation. The case was later transferred to state-level investigators for continued review. As of the most recent update, the investigation remained active, with authorities continuing to analyze evidence and seek information. No charges had been filed, and Jennifer's whereabouts remained unknown. The case continued to be referenced as an example of unresolved disappearances involving delayed evidence review and evolving investigative methods. Case 7, May 20, 1975, Concord, New Hampshire. 21-year-old Judith Lord was found deceased inside her apartment while her infant son cried in a nearby room. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when rent collectors received no response at her door despite hearing a child inside. Entry into the apartment led to the discovery of her body. Within days, attention turned toward individuals who had close access to her apartment in the hours before her death. The case began when the operations manager of the Concord Gardens apartment complex arrived to collect overdue rent. After hearing an infant crying and receiving no response to repeated knocks, he entered the unit to check on the child's safety. Inside, he discovered Judith lying on a bed, unresponsive, with clear signs of violence. Her infant son was located unharmed in a crib in an adjacent room. Police were contacted immediately and secured the scene. Investigators documented evidence of a struggle, including disturbed furnishings and household items displaced from their original positions. An alarm clock frozen at a specific time suggested the confrontation occurred during the night. The apartment was processed as a homicide scene, and an autopsy was ordered. Judith had been born in 1953 and raised in a large family before later settling in New Hampshire. She married Gregory Lord Sr. while he was serving in the military, and the couple lived overseas for a period following their marriage. After returning to the United States, they settled in Concord with their young son. Judith was known to neighbors as friendly and involved in the apartment community. In the weeks before her death, her marriage had become strained, and she had recently separated from her husband. She had adjusted her work and daily routines during this period. Her role as a young mother and her regular habits placed her within a predictable environment. It would take only days for her private life to become central to a homicide investigation. The autopsy confirmed that Judith died from strangulation and showed evidence consistent with sexual assault. Investigators recovered hairs and biological material from the scene, along with items indicating a violent struggle. Early attention focused on several individuals, including Judith's estranged husband and nearby neighbors. Her husband provided an alibi and was later cleared. Another neighbor was eliminated due to lack of evidence. Ernest Theodore Gable, who lived in an adjoining apartment and shared a wall with Judith, emerged as a person of interest. Witnesses reported that Judith had expressed fear of him. Investigators also located his fingerprints on the exterior of her windows. However, hair comparison tests conducted at the time produced results that incorrectly excluded him, halting further action. Decades later, the case was reopened following acknowledgement by federal authorities that many forensic hair analyses from the 1970s were unreliable. Investigators re-examined the evidence using modern techniques. Preserved biological material from the crime scene was submitted for DNA testing. In 2025, the results conclusively identified Ernest Theodore Gable as the source of the male DNA recovered. The corrected forensic findings aligned with early suspicions that had never been resolved. The renewed analysis established a direct link between Gable and the crime, resolving questions that had persisted for nearly 50 years. By the time the identification was made, Gable had been deceased for decades, having died in California in 1987. Authorities confirmed that criminal charges would have been pursued had he been alive. The case was formally closed with Gable named as the responsible party. For Judith's family, the conclusion provided long-delayed clarity about what had happened in 1975. Investigators emphasized that the outcome demonstrated the consequences of flawed forensic methods and the importance of re-examining cold cases with updated technology. Case 8. December 24, 2004, Connecticut. 51-year-old Robert Kavanaugh failed to return home from work and was reported missing by his family. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when repeated attempts to contact him were unsuccessful. His absence was uncharacteristic and raised immediate concern. Within days, attention turned toward his vehicle and growing worries about his safety and well-being. Robert was last known to have left work on December 24 and did not arrive home as expected. When family members were unable to reach him, they contacted local authorities to report him missing. Police gathered information regarding his last known movements, employment schedule, and vehicle description. A missing person alert was issued that included details of his pickup truck, which investigators believed could be central to locating him. Early search efforts focused on areas along his usual travel routes and places he was known to frequent. Despite these efforts, no confirmed sightings were reported. The lack of physical evidence or witnesses complicated initial progress and left investigators with limited direction. Robert was married and a father of 4, living what appeared to be a stable family life. He had worked as a long-haul truck driver before transitioning into a career as a correctional officer in Connecticut. In the period leading up to his disappearance, he had been experiencing personal and mental health struggles that were not widely known. Outside his immediate circle. These challenges were later considered during the investigation as authorities assessed possible explanations for his disappearance. Despite concerns, there was no indication he intended to leave his family or abandon his responsibilities. His background and routine suggested his absence was unusual and warranted continued investigation. In the years following his disappearance, law enforcement maintained the case as open but unresolved. Community members and advocacy organizations assisted by offering a reward for information that could lead to answers. Over time, however, public attention diminished and no new leads emerged. The case remained unsolved for more than 2 decades, with investigators periodically reviewing available information. Without evidence indicating criminal involvement or a clear trail to follow, the investigation produced no definitive conclusions. Robert's disappearance became one of many long-term missing person cases with unanswered questions. On October 5, 2025, human remains were discovered in Mansfield Hollow Lake by local emergency responders. A subsequent search led to the recovery of a submerged vehicle matching the description of Robert's pickup truck. Items found inside the vehicle supported the possibility that it belonged to him. DNA analysis conducted the following month confirmed the remains were Robert Kavanaugh. The discovery established what had happened after years of uncertainty and provided factual resolution to the case. With the identification confirmed, authorities officially closed the missing person investigation. Family members were informed and later held a private funeral. While the discovery ended decades of searching, it also renewed discussions about mental health awareness and support. Investigators noted that the case underscored the importance of continued attention to unresolved disappearances. For Robert's family, the conclusion brought clarity after many years without answers. Case 9. February 19, 1971, Lake Panasoffkee, Florida. An unidentified young woman was found deceased beneath a highway overpass after being discovered partially submerged near the roadway. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared with evidence of strangulation and extended exposure to the elements. The condition of the remains indicated she had been there for weeks. Within days, the victim became known publicly as Little Miss Panasoffkee. The body was discovered by 2 teenage hitchhikers who noticed a figure beneath the overpass and contacted authorities. Responding officers documented significant decomposition consistent with prolonged exposure to water and weather. A man's belt was found fastened around the victim's neck, indicating death by strangulation. Investigators estimated the killing had occurred several weeks earlier. Clothing and personal items were recovered, including jewelry and a wristwatch, suggesting the victim may have been married. A fractured rib led investigators to believe force had been applied during the assault. Despite thorough processing of the scene, no identification documents were found, and no witnesses could be located. Early investigative conclusions confirmed homicide but provided no clear suspect or identity. The victim was estimated to be between 17 and 24 years old, approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall, with dark hair and brown eyes. Her clothing consisted of green and patterned garments that were cataloged for identification purposes. Jewelry worn at the time of death was preserved and photographed. Despite these details, no missing person reports matched her description. She had never been reported missing, which significantly hindered identification efforts. Over time, she remained known only by her case nickname, with no confirmed ties to family, employment, or residence. Decades passed with no name assigned, and her case remained unresolved despite periodic reviews. In February 1986, the body was exhumed to allow for additional forensic examination as technology advanced. Facial reconstructions were created and distributed in 1971, and again decades later, but neither effort resulted in identification. Investigators continued to preserve evidence and re-examine records as methods improved. The case remained active in name, but produced no definitive leads. Law enforcement revisited the file multiple times, applying updated forensic approaches as they became available. Each review confirmed homicide but failed to resolve the victim's identity or circumstances. In 2025, investigators employed modern fingerprint analysis technology to re-examine prints recovered from the remains. These prints were compared against historical arrest records using advanced matching systems. The comparison produced a match to a 1970 arrest record under the name Maureen Lou Minor Rowan. Further verification confirmed her identity. The breakthrough did not rely on DNA, but on technological advancements in latent fingerprint processing. The identification established her birth in 1949 and confirmed she had lived in Florida prior to her death. Following identification, authorities notified surviving family members and updated official records. Investigators confirmed Maureen Rowan had never been reported missing, explaining why the case remained unresolved for more than 5 decades. The investigation into her death remained open, with renewed focus on reconstructing her final movements and associations during 1970 and 1971. Officials issued public appeals for information from anyone who knew Maureen or had contact with her during that period. While her identity was restored, the circumstances of her death continued to be examined. Case 10, 2013, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Melissa Zimmerman was found injured following an indecent assault after being discovered by a passerby. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when evidence from her medical examination was collected but not processed for testing. The absence of timely forensic analysis prevented immediate investigative progress. Within years, the case was officially closed without charges, leaving the assault unresolved. The incident occurred after Melissa became separated from her group while attending an event. She was approached by an unknown man who offered assistance with a cell phone. When the device did not function, the man pushed her into a ditch and restrained her. Emergency services were contacted after a passerby found her injured and alerted authorities. First responders transported her to a medical facility, where an assault examination was conducted. Biological evidence was collected and forwarded to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. At the time, investigators documented the assault and initiated a case file. However, no immediate suspect was identified, and the evidence collected was not subjected to forensic testing. Little information about Melissa's personal background was released publicly. Investigators established that she had been out socially prior to the assault and became separated from companions shortly before the incident. Following discovery, she received medical treatment and cooperated with the initial response process. The examination generated an assault kit intended to support identification of the perpetrator. Beyond these immediate steps, the case record contained limited contextual detail. Her separation from her group and the absence of witnesses narrowed early investigative avenues. The medical examination became the primary source of potential evidence linking an offender to the crime. Despite the seriousness of the assault, the evidence collected remained untested for years. The case was later marked as closed, with records indicating the victim did not wish to proceed. This notation effectively halted further investigative action. Over time, the lack of forensic testing became a central issue. The assault kit remained in storage as part of a broader backlog. The discrepancy between the case closure and the unused evidence drew later scrutiny. The absence of testing meant no suspect could be identified, and the case remained dormant despite the existence of preserved biological material. In 2024, a separate criminal investigation led authorities to collect a DNA sample from Mohammed Bully. That sample was entered into forensic systems and compared against evidence from unresolved cases. The comparison produced a match with the biological material preserved from Melissa's 2013 assault kit. Following confirmation, prosecutors reopened the case and reviewed the long-delayed evidence. Charges were filed linking Bully to the assault, formally reviving a case that had remained inactive for more than a decade. In November 2025, a jury found Mohammed Bully guilty of charges related to the assault. He was sentenced to a lengthy term of imprisonment. The conviction concluded the revived case and highlighted systemic issues related to untested assault kits. Prosecutors emphasized institutional efforts to address evidence backlogs and prevent similar delays. The case was cited as an example of how deferred forensic testing can delay accountability, even when evidence exists. Case 1. On December 20, 1996, Julie Buskin, a 21-year-old university student in Oklahoma City, was reported missing after she failed to return home following an early morning drive to the airport. Hours earlier, residents at her apartment complex reported hearing a woman scream in the parking lot before dawn. When Julie did not appear for a scheduled lunch later that day and could not be reached, concern quickly escalated. Her car was also missing, adding urgency to the situation. Within a short period, investigators began to suspect that Julie's disappearance was not voluntary. Julie's last confirmed movements began the previous evening. She spent time with friends and later drove her roommate to Will Rogers World Airport in the early morning hours. Surveillance and witness accounts placed her leaving the airport alone shortly after the drop-off. Around 5:30 a.m., residents at Julie's apartment complex reported a scream coming from the parking area, prompting a 911 call. No suspect or vehicle was seen at the time. By midday, Julie had failed to meet friends and did not respond to calls. Her absence was formally reported, and law enforcement initiated a search focused on her apartment, travel route, and known contacts. Julie Buskin was known as a dedicated student and aspiring dancer. She was working toward a bachelor's degree and had plans to open a dance studio after graduation. She held a part-time job at the university golf course and was described as socially active, well-liked, and reliable. Investigators found no evidence of personal conflicts, recent disputes, or behavior suggesting she intended to disappear. Her routine was predictable, and she was known to trust familiar environments. Friends and family reported no concerns in the days leading up to her disappearance, reinforcing the belief that an external act had interrupted her normal routine. Approximately 12 hours after she was last seen, Julie's body was discovered at a lake roughly 15 miles from her apartment. Her hands were bound, and she had been shot once in the back of the head at close range. Forensic examination indicated sexual assault. Investigators documented 2 sets of footprints leading to the water's edge and only 1 set returning. A footprint consistent with a size 9 men's Nike running shoe was preserved. Nearby, a pink leotard belonging to Julie was recovered and later found to contain male DNA. Her car was eventually located near her apartment complex, containing red sand consistent with the lake area. Her phone was missing, and phone records later showed calls made after her death, including one to a weather service. For years, the case produced few leads. Investigators interviewed numerous acquaintances and tested DNA from more than 200 men. A composite sketch based on a witness who followed Julie's car near the lake generated tips, but no arrest. The investigation regained momentum when Anthony Castillo Sanchez came to police attention years later. He lived near Julie's apartment at the time of the crime and owned shoes consistent with the footprint evidence. Records revealed that a phone number dialed from Julie's phone closely resembled that of one of Sanchez's former partners. Ballistic analysis linked the bullet used in the killing to a firearm associated with Sanchez's residence. When DNA testing technology advanced, Sanchez's DNA was compared to the sample recovered from the leotard, producing a definitive match. Anthony Castillo Sanchez was arrested and later convicted of Julie Buskin's murder in 2006. He received a death sentence. Over the years, he pursued multiple appeals and claimed that another family member was responsible, but those claims were reviewed and rejected based on DNA probability analysis. The conviction stood, and the case became a landmark example of the power of preserved evidence and advancing forensic science. Julie Buskin's case remains cited in discussions of cold case investigations, illustrating how delayed justice can still be achieved through methodical evidence handling and scientific progress. Case 2. On May 31, 1984, Laura Sammons, an 18-year-old college student, was found murdered in a rural field outside Murfreesboro, Tennessee. She had failed to arrive at several planned destinations that afternoon, raising concern among those who knew her. When her body was discovered, investigators immediately noted signs of a violent and personal attack. Clothing found at the scene and the condition of her body suggested she had been killed elsewhere or moved shortly after her death. From the outset, the circumstances indicated that Laura had encountered someone she knew or trusted. Laura's body was discovered by a local farmer who noticed clothing lying in a field along his route home. Upon closer inspection, he realized a body was concealed beneath the garments and contacted authorities. Laura was partially unclothed, with additional clothing items placed over her body, including a pair of men's jeans. The autopsy determined she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, likely caused by rocks found nearby. Evidence also showed that she had been intimate with someone within the previous day. At the time, investigators could not determine whether her final movements involved consent or coercion, leaving critical questions unanswered. Laura Sammons was a student at Middle Tennessee State University and worked as a cashier at a local grocery store. On the day she disappeared, she completed her work shift around midday and planned to attend a university appointment before going swimming at her grandmother's home. She never arrived at either location. Her car was later found near her workplace, miles away from where her body was discovered. Laura was socially active and maintained relationships with friends and former partners, but there was no indication she was involved in conflicts or dangerous behavior. Her routine that day appeared ordinary, making her sudden disappearance all the more alarming. Investigators pursued multiple leads in the early stages of the case. Witnesses reported seeing Laura at a nightclub the night before her death with an unidentified man, but he was never located. A former boyfriend was examined but ruled out due to an alibi. Forensic testing was limited by the technology available at the time, restricting the usefulness of DNA and hair evidence recovered from the scene and from Laura's vehicle. As weeks turned into months, the investigation stalled. Despite interviewing numerous individuals and exploring multiple theories, authorities were unable to establish a clear suspect or reconstruct Laura's final hours. Years later, the case was revived when a former acquaintance of Laura became a police officer and was assigned to cold cases. Advances in forensic science allowed previously collected evidence to be retested. DNA analysis of the men's jeans found at the scene revealed blood spatter patterns consistent with the attack and confirmed the blood belonged to Laura. Investigators re-examined earlier suspects and focused attention on David Gilley, a former boyfriend who had initially been cleared. New witness statements contradicted his original alibi, and his physical profile matched the clothing evidence recovered at the scene. In 2000, DNA testing confirmed that David Gilley was the source of the biological material found on the men's jeans, directly linking him to the crime. He was arrested 16 years after Laura Sammons was killed. At trial, prosecutors argued the motive was jealousy and loss of control as Laura moved on with her life. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. For Laura's family, the conviction marked the end of a long and painful wait for answers, closing a case that had remained unresolved for more than a decade. Case 3. In the early 1980s, two teenage girls were murdered in neighboring villages in Leicestershire, England, 3 years apart. The crimes occurred in quiet rural areas and involved similar methods of restraint and killing. At the time of the first murder, investigators treated it as an isolated incident. When the second killing occurred years later, the similarities became impossible to ignore. Together, the deaths of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth revealed the presence of a single, unknown offender operating undetected within close-knit communities. On November 21, 1983, 15-year-old Linda Mann left her home in Narborough to visit a friend but never arrived. When she failed to return by late evening, her family alerted police. The following morning, her body was discovered along a footpath near her home. She had been assaulted and strangled, with clothing removed and scattered nearby. Despite extensive searches and interviews, investigators were unable to identify a suspect. Nearly 3 years later, on July 31, 1986, 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth disappeared while walking home from work in the nearby village of Enderby. Her body was found days later in a field, showing the same pattern of assault and strangulation. The repetition suggested a single perpetrator, but no arrest followed. Linda Mann was a schoolgirl known for her routine habits and familiarity with local walking routes. Dawn Ashworth shared similar traits, attending the same school system and traveling alone along footpaths commonly used by local residents. Both girls lived in areas considered safe by their communities. After Linda's murder, families encouraged young people to walk in groups, but no structural changes were made. When Dawn was killed, fear spread quickly, as residents recognized the similarities between the cases. Despite this, early investigations failed to connect the crimes conclusively, and no sustained suspect focus emerged. Investigators initially concentrated on Richard Buckland, a local teenager who worked at a nearby psychiatric hospital. Buckland made inconsistent statements and eventually confessed to Dawn Ashworth's murder, later claiming responsibility for Linda Mann's death as well. He provided details that appeared to match the crime scenes. However, the confession raised concerns due to contradictions and Buckland's limited intellectual capacity. At the time, forensic testing relied primarily on blood type analysis, which could only narrow suspects to broad population groups. With no definitive physical evidence, Buckland was charged, while doubts about the reliability of the confession persisted. The investigation took an unprecedented turn when DNA fingerprinting was introduced. Genetic material from both crime scenes was analyzed by a forensic scientist pioneering the technique. The results demonstrated that the same man was responsible for both murders, but Richard Buckland's DNA did not match the samples. Buckland was released, becoming the first person exonerated by DNA evidence. Investigators then conducted a voluntary mass DNA screening of thousands of local men. During this process, it was discovered that Colin Pitchfork had persuaded another man to submit a sample on his behalf. Further testing exposed the deception, and Pitchfork's DNA was conclusively matched to both murders, leading to his arrest. Colin Pitchfork pleaded guilty to the murders of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth in 1988. He received a life sentence, though the absence of a minimum term recommendation caused public concern. The case drew widespread attention for its groundbreaking use of DNA evidence, which reshaped criminal investigations worldwide. For the families of Linda and Dawn, the resolution came after years of uncertainty. The case remains a landmark in forensic history, demonstrating both the fallibility of confessions and the transformative power of scientific evidence in criminal justice. Case 4. Between 1983 and 1987, a series of assaults and murders occurred in Virginia, targeting women inside their homes. The crimes shared consistent features, including forced entry, restraint, sexual assault, and strangulation. At the time, the incidents were investigated separately by local agencies. Early assumptions treated each attack as an isolated event. Only years later did investigators recognize the pattern, indicating a single offender operating across multiple jurisdictions. The earliest known attacks occurred in Arlington County in 1983, beginning with abductions and sexual assaults involving women encountered in their cars or homes. Over several months, the violence escalated. In January 1984, Carolyn Hom was found bound and strangled in her garage. Shortly afterward, David Vasquez, a fast food worker with limited intellectual capacity, was arrested and confessed to the crime. Despite inconsistencies between Vasquez and witness descriptions, the confession led to his conviction, and the assaults in Arlington stopped. Authorities believed the threat had been eliminated. That assumption would later prove incorrect. In 1987, similar crimes began occurring in Richmond, Virginia. Debbie Davis was found bound, assaulted, and strangled in her apartment. Weeks later, Susan Helms was discovered murdered under nearly identical circumstances less than a mile away. Diane Cho, a 15-year-old student, was killed in her bedroom after reporting being followed by an unknown man. Sue Tucker was later found murdered in her home in Arlington County, showing the same method of entry, restraint, and killing. The victims differed in age and background, but the crime scenes shared unmistakable similarities, indicating a consistent offender. Investigators from Richmond and Arlington began sharing information as the pattern became clearer. Crime scene details showed repeated use of bindings taken from household materials, forced entry through windows, and strangulation. Geographic analysis revealed that the offender moved between jurisdictions, exploiting gaps in coordination. The crimes in Arlington and Richmond were reviewed alongside parole and incarceration records to determine whether a single individual could account for the timeline. Analysts noted that the offender appeared to stop during periods consistent with incarceration for unrelated offenses, strengthening the serial offender theory. Attention turned to Timothy Spencer, a convicted burglar with a history of parole violations. Records showed he had been released to a halfway house in Richmond shortly before the 1987 murders began. Surveillance confirmed that Spencer frequented locations connected to multiple victims, including the Cloverleaf Mall. He was observed violating parole conditions and traveling between Richmond and Arlington on dates consistent with the attacks. Investigators collected a blood sample and submitted it for DNA analysis, a technique that had only recently been used in criminal cases in the United States. DNA testing matched Spencer to biological evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes in both Richmond and Arlington. The results led him to the murders of Debbie Davis, Susan Helms, Diane Cho, and Sue Tucker, as well as several surviving assault victims. The findings also excluded David Vasquez from involvement in the death of Carolyn Hom. Spencer was arrested in January 1988 and charged with multiple counts of murder and sexual assault. The DNA evidence established a direct forensic connection across jurisdictions, confirming the existence of a single serial offender. Timothy Spencer was convicted later in 1988, becoming the first person in the United States convicted of murder based on DNA evidence. He received multiple life sentences and was later executed in 1994. Following the conviction, David Vasquez was exonerated and released after serving years in prison for a crime he did not commit. The case marked a turning point in forensic science and criminal justice, demonstrating the reliability of DNA evidence and reshaping how serial crimes are investigated and prosecuted across jurisdictions. Case 5. On March 3, 1987, Kathy Odom was found brutally murdered inside her home in Harris County, Texas. Her 4-year-old daughter, Tasha, survived a violent beating and was discovered unconscious, while her infant son was found unharmed in his crib. The crime scene immediately suggested a personal attack rather than a random intrusion. There were no signs of forced entry, and the level of violence directed at Kathy raised suspicions that the perpetrator was someone familiar with the household. Police were alerted after Kathy's husband, Mike Odom, failed to reach her by phone and asked a neighbor to check on the family. When officers entered the house, they found Kathy's body in the bedroom. She had been stabbed repeatedly, strangled, sexually assaulted, and bound with an electrical cord taken from a lamp. Her clothes were found neatly folded on the floor. Blood was present throughout the room. Tasha was located on the living room sofa with severe head injuries, while the infant remained asleep. Investigators initially focused on Mike, noting stains on his clothing and inconsistencies in his account, as well as the possibility that the attacker had attempted to clean up before leaving. Kathy Odom had been married to Mike since her teenage years, and together they had 2 children. Her family described her as devoted to her role as a mother and determined to maintain stability despite a troubled past. Both Kathy and her sister had previously struggled with substance abuse, influenced by their spouses, but Kathy had made efforts to turn her life around. Extended family relationships were strained, particularly involving her sister Shelley and Shelley's husband, Greg Marquardt. Greg had a history of criminal behavior and drug use, and his interactions with Kathy in the period before her death had caused concern among those close to her. The investigation moved through several suspects. Mike Odom and the neighbor who checked the house were examined closely, but forensic testing later showed that suspicious stains were not blood, and both men had verifiable alibis. Attention then shifted to Greg Marquardt. He had been present in the home previously, had a known fixation on Kathy, and had access to the house on the day of the crime. His alibi left a significant time window unaccounted for, but early forensic testing relied on blood typing, which could not conclusively identify him. With no definitive physical evidence, the case stalled and remained unresolved for years. In the late 1990s, the case was reopened as DNA technology advanced. Investigators re-examined preserved evidence, focusing on the electrical cord used to bind Kathy's wrists. New testing methods demonstrated that skin cells could transfer during acts such as strangulation. DNA extracted from the cord revealed a profile consistent with Greg Marquardt, narrowing the pool of possible perpetrators to a small percentage of the population. Greg claimed he had been involved in a consensual relationship with Kathy and said she was alive when he left, but investigators determined that his DNA could only have been present on the cord if he had bound her during the attack. Greg Marquardt was arrested in 2002 and later confessed to the crime while in custody, describing how he attacked Kathy after she rejected him and assaulted her daughter to force compliance. In 2004, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 45 years in prison. He died of liver disease in 2008 after serving a portion of his sentence. For Kathy's family, the conviction brought delayed resolution but no relief from the loss. The case highlighted the importance of preserved evidence and evolving forensic science in resolving violent crimes long after they occur. Case 6. On March 26, 1993, 16-year-old Raina Risson vanished after completing a short shift at an animal hospital in La Porte, Indiana. She was expected to meet her former boyfriend later that evening but never arrived. When she failed to return home, concern grew quickly. By the following day, her disappearance was no longer considered routine. The discovery of her vehicle nearby, positioned in a way that suggested mechanical trouble, introduced immediate doubt. From the start, investigators believed Raina's absence involved deliberate human intervention rather than an accident. Witnesses later reported seeing Raina outside the animal hospital shortly before 6:00 p.m. with 2 unidentified men in a sedan. Some described what appeared to be an argument, though no one intervened at the time. Raina's car was found abandoned not far from her workplace with the hood raised, keys in the ignition, and her purse and money still inside. Officers were able to start the car without difficulty, indicating the breakdown had likely been staged. Early interviews focused on Raina's former and current romantic partners. While initial statements appeared cooperative, no clear suspect emerged, and the investigation quickly lost momentum. Raina Risson was a high school sophomore known for her academic discipline and compassion for animals. She held multiple part-time jobs and hoped to become a veterinarian. Friends described her as responsible and family-oriented. Her relationships were closely examined, including a recent reconciliation with a former boyfriend and a prior relationship with Jason Tibbs, who had a history of minor criminal behavior. Raina remained on speaking terms with Tibbs, and acquaintances confirmed she trusted familiar people. Nothing in her behavior suggested she intended to disappear voluntarily. As weeks passed, the case grew colder. A jacket belonging to Raina's former boyfriend was found miles away, but it yielded no usable evidence. In April 1993, Raina's body was discovered in a pond north of Lawport, weighed down with logs. An autopsy determined she had been strangled. Several individuals drew attention during the investigation, including a serial false confessor and a family member with a criminal past, but each lead collapsed under scrutiny. With no physical evidence linking a suspect to the crime, the case remained unsolved for years. In 2008, investigators received a letter from an inmate named Ricky Hammonds, who claimed he had witnessed critical events as a teenager in 1993. He described seeing Raina's body in the trunk of a car driven by Jason Tibbs and another man. This account led police to Eric Feldman, who agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. Feldman stated that Tibbs abducted Raina outside the animal hospital, strangled her after she attempted to flee, and later disposed of her body. The statements aligned with long-standing, unanswered questions in the case. Jason Tibbs was arrested in 2013, 20 years after Raina Risson was killed. At trial, the prosecution relied on witness testimony and corroborated timelines rather than physical evidence. Tibbs was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. He filed multiple appeals, maintaining his innocence and naming an alternate suspect, but those efforts were denied. For Raina's family, the verdict ended decades of uncertainty. The case remains an example of how delayed witness testimony can alter the course of a long, cold investigation. Case 7. In September 1993, 15-year-old Jessica Roach disappeared while riding her bicycle near her home in Georgetown, Illinois. When she failed to return, her family quickly realized something was wrong. Her bicycle was later found abandoned on the road, but there was no sign of Jessica herself. Initial searches produced no answers, and days turned into weeks without any indication of where she had gone. The lack of immediate evidence delayed the understanding of what had occurred, leaving her family and community in a prolonged state of uncertainty. Jessica was last seen on September 20, 1993. After her bicycle was discovered, police organized searches and distributed missing person information, but no credible sightings emerged. Approximately 6 weeks later, her remains were discovered in a rural area of Perrysville, Indiana, across state lines. The advanced state of decomposition limited what investigators could determine about the circumstances of her death. Environmental exposure made it difficult to establish an exact timeline or recover forensic evidence, complicating the investigation from its earliest stages. Jessica Roach was described as a motivated teenager with clear ambitions. She had expressed a desire to become a pilot and was supported by a close-knit family. Her disappearance deeply affected her community, which organized searches and later memorial events in her name. There was no indication that Jessica had conflicts or risky behavior that would explain her sudden disappearance. The randomness of the crime and her young age intensified public concern and pressure on law enforcement to identify the person responsible. Attention eventually turned to Larry Hall after reports surfaced of him following young girls in the region. During NG questioning, Hall exhibited suspicious behavior when shown Jessica's photograph. He later provided a confession that included claims of abducting and killing her, along with statements implicating himself in numerous other crimes. Investigators recognized a pattern of exaggerated and inconsistent confessions, raising concerns about their reliability. Despite this, certain details Hall provided aligned with known facts of Jessica's case, keeping him under scrutiny. Investigators separated Hall's false admissions from corroborated evidence. While many of his claims could not be verified, aspects of his account regarding Jessica were supported by independent findings. Law enforcement determined that Hall's involvement in Jessica Roach's murder was credible based on the totality of the evidence, even as other confessed crimes were discounted. This careful distinction allowed authorities to move forward without relying solely on his statements. Larry Hall was convicted of Jessica Roach's murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction brought a measure of closure to Jessica's family after years of unanswered questions. In the years that followed, her loved ones established memorial efforts and a scholarship in her name to honor her memory. The case remains a reminder of the challenges posed by delayed discovery and unreliable confessions in homicide investigations. Case 8. On September 21, 1996, Danielle Hinn, a 15-year-old high school student from Belgrade, Montana, was reported missing after she failed to return home from a planned solo fishing trip. She had told her family she was going to spend the day at Cambridge Fishing Access, a location she had visited before and considered familiar. When hours passed without contact, concern quickly grew. Later that day, her truck was found abandoned near the fishing area, immediately raising fears that something had gone wrong during what was supposed to be an ordinary outing. Danielle left her home that morning with fishing gear and no indication that she expected company. When she did not return by evening, family members began searching the area themselves. Authorities were notified after her truck was located parked near the fishing access. The vehicle was unlocked, and her personal belongings were still inside. There were no visible signs of a struggle around the truck, but Danielle was nowhere to be found. As daylight faded, search teams expanded efforts around the surrounding marshland and water, operating under the assumption that she could be injured or lost. Danielle Hinn was known to be close to her mother, Cheryl, and spent much of her free time outdoors. She followed a predictable routine and was comfortable being alone in nature. Her family described her as quiet and independent, with no known conflicts or risky behavior. The fishing trip was not unusual for her and was intended as a peaceful escape. The isolated nature of the area, however, meant there were few witnesses and limited opportunities for someone nearby to notice suspicious activity. Several hours after the search began, Danielle's body was discovered in shallow water not far from where her truck had been parked. She was found face down in the mud. The medical examination determined that she had been suffocated, with evidence indicating her head had been forcibly held down until she died. Investigators documented signs of assault but found little physical evidence pointing to a suspect. Despite extensive interviews and searches, no clear leads emerged, and the case eventually went cold. In 2019, investigators reopened the case, hoping advances in forensic science could succeed where earlier efforts had failed. Preserved evidence was sent to a specialized laboratory for analysis. Traditional DNA database searches produced no matches, prompting law enforcement to pursue genetic genealogy through court authorization. This process ultimately identified Paul Hutchinson, a man who had lived in the area at the time of Danielle's death. In July 2024, investigators interviewed Hutchinson at his home. His behavior during the encounter raised concerns, but before further questioning could occur, he took his own life. Following his death, forensic analysts confirmed that the DNA recovered from Danielle's case was a match to Hutchinson. Although no trial would take place, authorities formally identified him as responsible and closed the investigation. Danielle's family issued statements acknowledging the resolution while recognizing the years lost without answers. Law enforcement also announced a review of Hutchinson's past to determine whether he could be linked to other unresolved cases, marking the final chapter in a crime that had remained unanswered for nearly 3 decades. Case 9. In late 1998, Melissa Patton, a young mother of 2 living in the Atlanta area, vanished without explanation. She maintained regular contact with her family, making her sudden silence immediately concerning. Despite her absence, Her husband never reported her missing, nor did he notify her parents that she was gone. As weeks passed with no word from Melissa, unanswered questions began to accumulate, and her disappearance took on a troubling tone that suggested she had not left voluntarily. Melissa's last known contact with her family occurred on Thanksgiving Day in 1998, when she spoke with her parents by phone and discussed plans for Christmas. After that call, she was never heard from again. When she failed to attend holiday gatherings and later missed her mother's birthday, her family became alarmed. In April 1999, dismembered human remains were discovered discarded in trash bags in wooded and residential areas. The remains were found months apart, complicating identification. The condition of the body suggested deliberate dismemberment and concealment, immediately indicating a homicide. Melissa was married and raising 2 children at the time she disappeared. Family members later described her marriage as troubled, marked by documented domestic violence. Her relationships with extended family had grown strained, particularly as concerns mounted over her safety and isolation. Despite these difficulties, Melissa was devoted to her children and remained in contact with her parents, making her sudden disappearance inconsistent with her behavior. Those close to her believed she would not have abandoned her family without explanation. As investigators worked to identify the remains, attention turned to their location. The areas where the body parts were recovered were near a workplace previously associated with Melissa's husband. Investigators also noted the use of tools consistent with deliberate dismemberment. Reports surfaced that a saw had gone missing from that workplace around the same period. While these details raised suspicion, the lack of conclusive forensic evidence at the time prevented charges. The case stalled, leaving Melissa's disappearance unresolved. In 2003, advances in DNA testing allowed authorities to identify the remains as Melissa Patton. During this process, investigators examined the possibility of family involvement and formally eliminated Melissa's father as a suspect based on incarceration records and DNA evidence. With that avenue closed, focus returned to Melissa's husband, Christopher Wolfenbarger, whose actions following her disappearance continued to raise concern. Despite long-standing suspicions, prosecutors still lacked sufficient evidence to move forward at that time. In 2024, the case was re-examined using modern investigative techniques. Law enforcement announced that new developments had strengthened the case against Christopher Wolfenbarger, leading to his arrest in August of that year. Investigators stated that he had been a person of interest from the beginning. Family members publicly expressed relief that the case was finally moving forward, while acknowledging the pain of revisiting the loss. Legal proceedings remain pending, as authorities prepare to present the evidence surrounding Melissa Patton's death more than 2 decades after she disappeared. Case 10. In October 1987, the body of a newborn baby girl was discovered discarded inside a dumpster behind a business in Riverside, California. The infant had no identification, no witnesses connected to her birth, and no immediate clues pointing to who she was or who had left her there. The discovery shocked the community and prompted an urgent investigation, but with no missing persons reports or hospital records to reference, the newborn was known only as Baby Doe. The infant's body was found by a man searching through trash for recyclables. Authorities responded and secured the scene, confirming that the baby had been born alive. An autopsy conducted by the Riverside County Coroner's Office determined that the newborn had been killed shortly after birth. The findings ruled out natural causes and established the case as a homicide. Investigators canvassed the surrounding area, interviewed nearby residents and businesses, and searched for reports of unattended births or missing infants, but no immediate leads emerged. With no name, family, or medical records, investigators faced significant obstacles. There was no information about the baby's mother, no indication of where the birth had taken place, and no witnesses who could provide context. The lack of physical evidence beyond the body itself limited investigative options. Despite sustained efforts, the case produced no suspects, and as time passed, Baby Doe's identity remained unknown, leaving the case unresolved. For decades, the investigation remained dormant. Leads were exhausted, and traditional methods failed to produce answers. In 2020, the Riverside Police Department's Cold Case Unit revisited the case in collaboration with the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Team, and a nonprofit organization focused on advancing forensic justice. Investigators decided to pursue advanced DNA analysis, recognizing that modern genetic technology could succeed where earlier efforts had failed. Using preserved biological evidence, forensic analysts generated a DNA profile and applied genetic genealogy techniques. The analysis ultimately identified the baby's mother as Melissa Jean Avila, who had relocated across the country in the years following the crime. In August 2024, Avila, then living in Shelby, North Carolina, was located and arrested with assistance from federal fugitive task forces. The identification marked the first definitive breakthrough in the case since 1987. Avila was extradited to Riverside County, California, where she was formally charged in connection with the death of the newborn. She was booked into the Larry D. Smith Correctional Facility, and bail was set at $1.1 million. Prosecutors stated that DNA evidence would play a central role in the case. Court proceedings are pending, bringing the investigation closer to resolution nearly 37 years after the infant was found. Case 1. In July 2017, Illinois, Kayla Unbahan, a 9-year-old child, was reported missing after a court-ordered custody exchange failed to occur. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when Kayla and her mother did not arrive at the designated return location the day after a holiday visit. Within days, attention turned toward Kayla's mother, who had primary visitation but not legal custody at the time. The case began on July 5, 2017, when Kayla was scheduled to be returned to her father following a July 4th visit with her mother. The exchange never occurred. When repeated contact attempts failed, police were notified, and missing persons reports were filed. Investigators soon discovered that Kayla's mother had deleted her social media accounts and turned off her phone. Witness information placed her packing belongings into a vehicle shortly before disappearing. Family members stated she claimed to be taking a camping trip in Wisconsin and planned to return that evening. She never did, but the available evidence did not align with a temporary trip. Kayla lived primarily with her father under a custody ruling issued after her parents separated. The court had granted him permanent custody earlier that year. Kayla was described as having a stable routine, attending school regularly, and maintaining consistent contact with extended family. There were no known behavioral or safety concerns prior to the scheduled visit. Her disappearance disrupted an otherwise predictable custody arrangement. It would take only days for their quiet routine to unravel. Local police coordinated with state and federal agencies as the search expanded beyond Illinois. Tips were pursued across multiple states, and Kayla's information was entered into national missing child databases. Her father launched a GoFundMe campaign to support search efforts and potential private investigation costs. Public awareness grew over time, including national exposure when Kayla's case appeared briefly in a 2022 episode of a streaming true crime series highlighting parental abductions. Despite years of investigation, confirmed sightings remained absent. Then, a single civilian encounter changed the course of the case. On May 13, 2023, in Asheville, North Carolina, a woman recognized Kayla and her mother inside a retail store after recalling images from a televised program. She alerted store staff, who contacted local police. Officers coordinated with Illinois authorities and confirmed their identities. Kayla, then 15, was located safely. Her mother was taken into custody without incident. When confronted with the evidence, the case shifted from a long-term search to a legal proceeding spanning jurisdictions. Kayla was reunited with her father shortly after identification. Her mother was charged with child abduction and faced extradition proceedings before returning to Illinois. Bond conditions included electronic monitoring and travel restrictions. A protective order barred contact with Kayla's father. Court hearings were scheduled to address the charges, which carried potential prison time but were often resolved through probation. To this day, the case remains a reference point for how public awareness and civilian action can abruptly resolve years-long investigations. Case 2. On December 31, 2008, in Ignacio, Colorado, Larry Fuller, a 49-year-old diesel mechanic and father of 4, was shot and killed while walking home after a New Year's Eve celebration. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when emergency responders found Fuller wounded on a residential street shortly after midnight. Within days, attention briefly turned toward a possible dispute earlier that evening, though no suspect was identified. The case began late on December 31, 2008, when Larry Fuller and his wife visited a local bar to celebrate the new year. After leaving the bar, the couple walked home together. Less than 2 hours into January 1, Fuller was shot by an unknown individual on the route. He succumbed to his injuries at the scene. There were no confirmed witnesses, and no weapon was recovered. Early investigative assumptions focused on a potential altercation at the bar, but interviews failed to support that theory. But the evidence at the scene did not match the initial story. Larry Fuller had lived in Colorado for years with his wife and children. He worked steadily as a diesel mechanic and was described by family members as reliable and deeply involved in home life. He maintained close relationships with stepchildren and was considered a parental figure beyond his immediate household. His death left unresolved financial and emotional strain for the family. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. For years, the investigation produced no arrests. Community rumors circulated, but none could be substantiated. Witness information remained limited, and physical evidence did not yield clear direct. As time passed, the case grew cold. In 2023, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation assumed lead responsibility at the request of local authorities. Investigators reopened interviews and reassessed earlier information. Then, renewed witness cooperation altered the trajectory of the case. On May 18, 2023, David Hendren, then 38, was arrested in Arizona. Authorities stated that witness interviews conducted during the renewed investigation led to his identification. Details surrounding the shooting, including motive and weapon, were sealed following the arrest. Hendren was taken into custody and held pending extradition to Colorado. When confronted with the accumulated evidence, the focus of the case shifted after nearly 15 years. Hendren awaited extradition to Colorado to face charges in La Plata County. Investigators released limited information, citing the ongoing judicial process. Family members stated the arrest brought a sense of delayed resolution, though many questions remained unanswered. The case left unresolved issues regarding motive and circumstance, details that have not been made public. To this day, the sealed nature of the evidence has left portions of the case unexplained. Case 3. On December 14, 1991, in Federal Way, Washington, Sarah Yarborough, a 16-year-old high school honor student, was found murdered near her school hours after arriving for a drill team event. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when her body was discovered in a wooded area adjacent to campus grounds. Within days, attention turned toward an unidentified man seen near the scene shortly before her death. The case began that morning when Sarah drove to Federal Way High School for a scheduled drill team activity. Her vehicle was later found parked in the school lot, undisturbed. At approximately 9:40 a.m., 2 students walking through nearby woods discovered her body concealed in bushes. She had been assaulted and strangled, with clothing evidence suggesting a violent encounter at the location. Witnesses reported seeing a man leaving the wooded area around the same time. A composite sketch was created and circulated, and biological evidence was carefully collected and preserved. But the evidence at the scene didn't match the initial assumptions. Sarah lived with her parents and younger brother and was described as disciplined and academically driven. She was active in school programs, including the drill team, and maintained a structured routine. There were no known conflicts, behavioral issues, or indicators of elevated risk in her daily life. Her disappearance and death shocked the school community and disrupted a sense of safety around the campus.